Are you worried about the rise of fascism and the far right in your own community? Do you feel powerless and are looking for what to do? Do you feel like the state is doing too little to fight this historical evil? Then you've clicked on the right video. If you want to know what Antifa is, its history, its ideas, its criticism, its tactics, beyond its portrayal in the media, or beyond the simple fact that it's a faster way to write anti-fascism, then stick around and maybe you can join Antifa. Hi, I'm Sean, and I'm a card-carrying member of Antifa, and after talking with the board of directors, the shareholders, and the CEO of Antifa, I came to the conclusion that a lot of people, especially in the United States, have no idea who we are and what we do. On September 22nd, 2025, Trump declared Antifa a terrorist organization. According to a 2025 Center Square Voters Voice poll, 49% of American voters supported this designation, while only 30% opposed it.
Mr. Glasstein, will you tell me any domestic terrorist organization that poses a threat to the homeland as we speak?
I'd say the first one, President Trump had just announced Executive Order Domestic Terrorist Organization, Antifa. That's our primary concern right now.
All right, that's what President Trump did. What does the FBI say?
We share the same view. When you look at the data right now, you look at the domestic terrorist threat that we're facing. Right now, what I see from my position is that's the most immediate violent threat that we're facing on the domestic side.
So where is Antifa headquartered?
What we're doing right now with the organization.
Where in the United States does Antifa exist? If it's a terrorist organization, and you've identified it as number one.
We are building out the infrastructure right now.
I just want you to tell us. If you said Antifa is the number one domestic terrorist organization operating in the United States, I just need to know where they are, how many people.
Well, the investigations are active.
So you wouldn't come to this committee and say something you can't prove, I know. I know you wouldn't do that. But you did.
In October 2025, YouGov showed that most Americans have an unfavorable opinion of Antifa, preferring the NRA, Turning Point USA, Blue Lives Matter, and All Lives Matter. Republicans preferred the Proud Boys and the Aryan Brotherhood to Antifa. Oh, you don't know what the Aryan Brotherhood is? It's simply a neo-Nazi prison gang and an organized crime syndicate that is based in the United States and has an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 members both inside and outside prisons. This is their logo. The only thing Republicans hate more than these guys are the KKK, BLM, and Antifa. It's unhinged. So we told ourselves at Antifa, we should probably make a recruitment video. Hi, actual Sean here. Oh, Jesus. Is my hair okay? I hope it's okay. Actual Sean here, not the Antifa character. Not the Antifa character, but Sean Grenier the canvas. I'm the Sean part. I may make a couple of jokes in this video about George Soros, a billionaire that right-wingers accuse of funding Antifa, or I might make jokes about Antifa being a highly regimented and hierarchically organized and centralized group with membership cards and all that stuff. This is obviously fake. These two anti-fascists are hilarious jokes. At least I find them funny. Antifa is extremely decentralized, anti-capitalist. They're often affinity groups, just friends getting together for community defense, organizing counter-protests, and a huge part of its philosophy is to remain decentralized and horizontal. It's not an organization where you can sign up to be a member. It doesn't have leaders. And that really confuses and pisses off the people Antifa are resisting against. These jokes will be understood by, I hope, a majority of people because of how absurd the idea that Antifa, an anarchist group, would have a CEO, or would be supported by a billionaire, or would have chiefs, bosses, or superiors. This majority, most viewers who will watch this video, are probably already on board with the whole Antifa thing and are just here to gain better theoretical tools to understand or to defend its philosophy. However, Some of you may be on the fence. Some of you may not know what Antifa is at all. Some of you may be here because you oppose it, and some of you are cops or some country's secret service. You may even be an FBI agent trying to understand America's #1 terrorist threat. You know there's at least one FBI agent who is watching this video. To that one agent, you're who I'm talking about right now. So because a minority of you didn't come to this video already convinced, and therefore may not understand why it's hilarious for us to frame Antifa as being hierarchically organized with billionaire funders, I felt the need to include you in the joke. Now you're in on the joke. You are part of us now. You're already one step closer to being Antifa. See? That's how indoctrination works. And that applies to you, FBI agent. In this video, not only will you learn how to join Antifa, but you'll also get the essential information to understand it and to become a good Antifa soldier if you wish to be. I'll start off by giving you an example of Antifa in action by telling you the story of an action I initiated with some friends in Gaspésie, a rural region in Quebec, Canada. I even made some pins, Gaspésie Antifasciste, right here. Anyway, that Antifa story in Chandler is one of interactions with local government, with the media, with the police, getting messages and threats from local fascists, attempts at mobilizing the community, and so on and so forth. I believe this anti-fascist action is a good case study as it illustrates what many anti-fascist actions look like, and is also a personal story, so I can tell it from my perspective, tell you some lessons I learned, and identify theory in practical application. I strongly encourage you to go back to that story once you've finished this video with the new theoretical tools I gave you in order to see if you can apply them in a practical scenario. Once we're done with the story, we'll look at the different types of anti-fascisms and identify where Antifa locates itself. Then, because Antifa is a counter-movement, it says it in its name, anti-fascism, we'll first need to look at what it opposes. We'll look at fascism and fascists. That's also where I'll explain why I believe Antifa is an anarchist movement, and we'll go into its criticism of liberalism. We'll then, of course, look at the tactics used by Antifa. That is, after all, why it's so infamous. Finally, I want to look at Antifa as a prefigurative method of community self-defense, which will help us understand why it's been categorized as a terrorist organization. And all throughout the video, we'll look at more aspects of Antifa such as its history, and I think it's important to remind you that there's no Antifa rules or laws, so a lot of Antifa activists will disagree. Some prefer to do their actions masked, some others don't. Some are more comfortable with violence, some others aren't. There's a wide variety of Antifa activists, and the one I'll be sharing is my own perspective influenced by my own experience while organizing and through the research I've done. Speaking of which, sources? I read Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook by historian Mark Bray, which was a really good introduction to the subject. I also read Découvrir l'antifascisme by historian Stéphanie Precioso, which did an overview of historical anti-fascism prior to World War II. My favorite reading was American Antifa, The Tactics, Culture, and Practice of Militant Anti-Fascism by Stanislav Vysotsky, which takes a more sociological approach to the movement. There's also this book, 10 questions sur l'antifascisme by a French collective of activists called La Horde, which, just like Mark Bray's book, was a pretty good introduction, written in an FAQ format, which I personally prefer. I also went through a lot of zines, which I recommend you look into online or at your local anarchist library or bookstore, as they're super accessible. Also, this video is a bit of a companion piece to the video I made on fascism. So some of the books I referenced there might surface back, including Fascisme Tranquille by philosopher? I don't know, he has a doctorate in philosophy, Jonathan Durand-Fulco. There's also the video Philosophy Tube made a couple of years ago on anti-fascism. I might refer to it a couple of times. I also read the very short pamphlet Antifa, What Americans Need to Know About the Alt-Left by WorldNet Daily, a far-right outlet which gained notoriety by peddling conspiracy theories about Obama not actually being born in the United States. Honestly, I expected worse from that book, but it was still obviously very bad. It's super pro-Trump, tries to spook you about critical race theory, says that Antifa hates white people, that it actually hates and attacks everyone who disagrees with them, that it's against abortion and says it's hypocritical for, on one hand, defending movements advocating for people of color, queer movements, or defending Muslims and Jews from Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. But on the other hand, it stands against movements advocating for white people, straight people, or to even stay silent in the face of Christian persecution. So hypocritical, Antifa. Anyway, the criticisms of Antifa it had were grade school level, but its understanding of what Antifa isn't that bad, actually. It's a bit surprising. But it's really bad. It's far-right propaganda. Wait, what is it? What is it, Mr. Soros? You want me to say fascist propaganda? But don't you think we call everything fascist nowadays? And maybe... Okay, I'll do it. I'll do it again. Sorry, Mr. Soros. But it's still really bad. It's fascist propaganda. I'm really excited to tell you about my Antifa story, but before going into that, I want to establish a broad, basic understanding of what Antifa is, and then, throughout this video, we'll nuance and detail it further. Also, I want to shout out Jonathan, Ori, Akko, and McKinley. 4 people who recognized me either in the streets or at the anarchist bookstore I volunteer at. I'm shouting them out in the video, with their consent, obviously, because, well, it's my way of saying thank you for chatting with me, because I really liked it. Now, I want people in the comments to say hello to Jonathan, Ori, Akko, and McKinley. Say hello to them in the comments, as we sometimes do as a community. All right, go do that. So Antifa is short for anti-fascism, but you probably knew that already. Antifa has many aspects to it. I really like Precioso's formula of framing Antifa as discourse, as a set of tactics, and as a mobilizing myth. Bray and Vysotsky emphasize on its decentralized nature, a cultural or subcultural phenomena with its traditions, symbols, and practice. Even the far-right propaganda recognizes that Antifa has no central command or supreme leader, to then immediately compare it with ISIS. Antifa often works as affinity groups, groups of friends who are concerned about the presence of fascist individuals, groups, events, or mobilizing in their community. One way I like to understand Antifa is as a method of community self-defense. As we'll see with the example I'll give of my own Antifa activism, Antifa doesn't do anything. It doesn't even exist if there's no fascist mobilizing. There's no Antifa if there's no Fa. Antifa, at least from Bray's, Vysotsky's, and my own experience, is largely anarchist because it's composed today of many anarchists and its methods and structures being highly democratic, spontaneous, non-hierarchical, and anti-authoritarian are anarchistic in nature, historically and contemporarily, for many different reasons which we'll see. Antifa has been composed of anti-capitalist, anti-racist, and anti-colonialist leftists. The best analogy I can give you to illustrate Antifa's vibe, purpose, and function is to imagine a world where firemen don't exist. You and your buddies may want to organize some kind of anti-fire unit, as you've seen some being organized in the past and in other places around the world. You saw some anti-fire stickers or something while visiting a city, and you thought, maybe it would be a good idea to put out fires before they spread. You and your group of friends get together when there's a fire, and you figure out how to put it out. First, you and your group of friends assess the threat. You fight fires because you believe them to be a danger. You may be prone to fires yourselves, and you believe that the current social situation in your community doesn't handle fires very well by either ignoring them or even stoking them. Second, you only get together spontaneously as a reaction to the fire. If there is no fire, you'll do other things. Third, you get together as buddies. Without any chiefs, there's no central authority telling you when and how to take out fires. You do it on a voluntary basis according to your abilities and means, and you decide as a group how to treat the fire in your specific context, which is why your group is independent and doesn't need any centralization. If the fire can be extinguished by talking to it, you'll do that. If that doesn't work, you might try a bucket of water. If that doesn't work, you'll use a fire extinguisher. And if that doesn't work, you'll take out the fire hose. Your group really doesn't want fires to spread. You've read history books and you've seen fires spread in Europe in the 1930s and 40s, and you don't want to take any chances of that shit blazing up again. There's so much to talk about, from what kind of tactics Antifa uses, to the justification for the use of violence, to its history, its symbols, its anarchism. What is anarchism? Why doesn't Antifa trust the police? Why doesn't it trust the state? Why is Antifa critical of liberalism? All of this will be answered. But first, it's time for the tea. Antifa. Time to spill some tea. I'm going to tell you the story of some anti-fascist actions I did in Gaspésie, a rural region of Quebec, Canada, more particularly in the town of Chandler, where I used to live. Chandler, counting 7,500 inhabitants, is a town that lost its paper mill in 1999, and things haven't been easy since. To illustrate how isolated this town is to Americans, the closest Walmart is 2.5 hours away. Young people leave to study and get jobs elsewhere, the population keeps getting older and older, there's a lot of economic distress, substance abuse, and 1 in 3 residents in Chandler hasn't finished high school. It's rough out there. In Chandler, there's this small cinema which sometimes rents their theater to people so they can organize private movie nights. One such movie night was advertised. A movie was to be shown in our small town, in our small movie theater, and it was going to be a documentary. Interesting, there's not much else happening in said town, so I look up what the movie is about. The Bruno Groening Phenomena, the sensational event from 1949, translated in 40 languages, with a quote of his saying, "Nothing is incurable, God is the greatest doctor." To add to all this, the event was 7 hours long, from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m., and linked an organization called Bruno Groening's Circle of Friends. What the fuck? A German dude that looks like this, with a name like that, doing miracle shit in 1949 Germany. I had to look it up, and I didn't have to look very far. Bruno Bernhard Groening was a German mystic who rose to fame in the late 1940s for performing faith healings. Prior to this, he was a member of the Nazi Party, serving in World War II and spending several months in a prisoner of war camp. He died of cancer at the age of 52. No, we don't laugh at faith healers who die at 52. Very insensitive. I didn't really need to know more. I decided to do a Facebook post to make people aware of the potential danger of such event. Careful, I wrote, the Cinema Paradiso is going to present a cult film, but not in a good way. Get it? Cult film, the guy is promoting a cult. Anyway, this incredible faith healer who died of cancer at the age of 52 was going to be promoted, and I warned my community to watch out if, for example, vulnerable, often older, people around them could fall prey to this sort of scheme. Many people reacted. I assume some people got in contact with the cinema, and a week later, the event was cancelled. The cinema's statement was basically that they hadn't checked what kind of movie was going to be screened, and that they don't associate nor tolerate this kind of thing, and that in the future, they'll be more vigilant of private events. I was very happy about this. I love my Cinema Paradiso for this. A bit later, I don't know exactly when, I sang a translated version of Bella Ciao at an open mic. First, I explained its history, how it was first sang by Italian women in rice fields to then be used by the anti-fascist partisans. It became and remained an anti-fascist song. However, I don't really like when people sing covers at open mics. Honey, we're not at karaoke. So I decided to make it an experience. I told people to sing the chorus of Bella Ciao with me to turn the song into a performance where we can all imagine ourselves as Italian anti-fascists in a bar singing an anti-fascist song. When I said that, I asked as a joke if there were any fascists in the room and that they should raise their hand. One man did. Ironically. So I just ignored it. Anyway, we sang Bella Ciao all together and it was great. I thought I had a video of the performance. I guess it was lost. Bella ciao, bella ciao, bella. That's all you get. A couple of days later, that same man who ironically said he was a fascist started posting on Facebook in favor of Trump. And though Trump is a fascist, I don't believe every one of his supporters is ideologically a fascist. We'll talk about this later, but some people support Trump because they believe he's better for the economy and ignore his fascist proposals, which, although it makes them wrong, stupid, and immoral, it doesn't mean they align with fascist ideas. They may just be ignorant of them or indifferent to them, still makes them bad, but technically not fascist. At the same time, some people supported Mussolini because he made the trains run on time, and today we'd call these people fascists. So maybe time will tell. However, if you live in Gaspésie and support Trump, that raises a red flag to me. Anyway, that one guy posted something about being in favor of Trump. I don't exactly remember the post, so I commented, "When you put up your hand at the open mic to say that you were a fascist, I really thought you were joking. I guess you weren't." To which someone from Chandler answered something along the lines of, "There's nothing wrong with being a fascist. We're all a little fascist in some ways. You're going to need to stop being so fragile and realize that you're in Gaspésie and that things are different from the city here." I answered that my great-grandfather, who lived in Chandler his whole life, joined the army during World War II to fight fascism. The idea that he, his friends, and other army veterans in Chandler were a little fascist was a betrayal to their memory. I often mentioned World War II as an anti-fascist fight in my public interventions. We'll get back to World War II veterans, but I love to bring up army veterans because fascists love to glorify armed forces, whether the cops or the army. So when you bring up the fact that strong men have fought and died to battle fascism, they get stunted, which is exactly what happened. Oh yeah, before that interaction, that same person who said that people in Gaspésie were all fascist in some ways came to an event I organized on Palestine, and he wasn't much pro-Palestine. He was more anti-Israel. But not in a good way. He was anti-Semitic, so we had to handle that, and it didn't go perfectly, but I don't want to go into the details of it. However, his Jewish elite arguments were called out as anti-Semitic. He pointed the fact that most people in the room weren't born nor grew up in Gaspésie. That will be important later. And he left angry and might have threatened some people, but let's not get into that. Anyway. This is all just context for what's about to happen. All of this took place at the beginning of 2025. Now, this is where the real event happens. I get a message on my personal Instagram from a group of 7 people wanting to book nights in my house, which I had turned into a hostel in the summer of 1924. Summer of 2024. I guess it could have been 1924, let's be honest. But since 2024, I had closed it. So I had a hostel for like a summer. I didn't have a hostel anymore, but they still messaged me. It was weird to have strangers message about my closed hostel on my personal Instagram, but in small towns, everybody knows each other, so maybe they were referred to me personally. Whatever. So they send me this message, and keep in mind, my Instagram account name is Seanarchiste, a play on words with Sean and anarchist, and that I'm very openly anti-fascist, having just led a leftist federal electoral campaign at the beginning of 2025. Here's the message. We are coming in July to Chandler for the 3rd edition of the Gaspésian Black Ritual, a far-right black metal festival. They then explained that the location of the festival, and I guess the date because they hadn't mentioned it either, were kept a secret because they wanted to, quote, avoid complications due to the crying of Antifas and other similar weaklings. They then specified that previous editions of the festival brought 200 to 450 people with bands and fans coming from different provinces in Canada, from the United States, and even from Europe. When I looked on their Instagram page titled Proud Snowy Owl, I realized that their profile picture was weirdly similar to Nazi symbolism, but with a Québécois twist, and going through their posts, you'd find far-right imagery such as images representing the crusade, a lot of police and army stuff, the thin blue line, a quote by Adolf Hitler, and literal Nazis with swastika banners with the caption, "Yesterday like tomorrow." Now, I saw through the fascists' game. They're sending me, Seanarchiste, the anarchist YouTuber, the person who argues against local fascists online, who publicly denounces a movie on some Nazi faith healer presented in a local cinema, who runs in the federal election campaigning for the end of capitalism while wearing a keffiyeh. They're sending that person an inquiry to sleep at this person's house. They want to book my place, but they don't have dates for it yet. And they add in the message that they're far right and complain about Antifa weaklings. Who says that when they're trying to book a place to stay? Something was fishy, and for once in Gaspésie, it wasn't in the ocean. That's a joke for my fellow Gaspésians, because Gaspésie is by the ocean, and there's a lot of fishing and stuff like that. I knew something was wrong, and no credit to my nose for smelling the fishiness, these fascists were terrible at hiding their game. I took for granted that they were starved for attention. They knew I had a platform that I could talk to the media as I relatively often did, and I assumed that they just wanted free publicity. They were provoking me, hoping to get repressed by Antifa to gain attention on their event. So I ignored it. The fascist strategy to provoke Antifa reaction in order to victimize themselves and get attention is something we'll talk about later. All right, let's put away this teacup. It's a good prop, but we're far into the story now. Anyway, the story could have ended there, but it didn't. On a poster advertising my 2024 hostel project, there was a phone number to contact us. This phone number is my friend's phone number. A couple of weeks after the ignored Instagram DM, they called it. Keep in mind, this friend of mine was born and raised in Gaspésie. He gets a call from an unidentified number and doesn't answer. The call is repeated a couple of times, so he finally answers, and from what he recalled, an AI voice was telling him that he wasn't on his land and that he wasn't welcome in Gaspésie, that he should leave, calling him a lost butterfly, and that there was going to be a far-right festival in Chandler in July. Confused and rightfully so, my friend hung up, wondering why someone would say he's not on his land considering he was born and raised there. He then realized that the call was probably meant for me, who wasn't born and raised in Gaspésie. So he calls me laughing, asking me if that one Nazi message I got was about a festival in July. I tell him, yes, and he tells me that Nazis called his phone with threats that were supposed to be targeted against me. Silly Nazis! From there, I decided to go to the police. Let me explain why. The reason why I did it wasn't because I expected them to do anything about it. As we'll see later in this video, they never do. If anything, the police will turn on you if you come at them with information about fascists, which they kind of did, but in any case, the reason why I went to the police is because I wanted to signal the threat I had just gotten in case someone broke into my house and I decided to defend myself, and if that situation turned lethal, I wanted to back myself up. Anyway, cops didn't help, we'll see why later, but I did back myself up, I guess. I don't know if that was worth it because it luckily never got to that point, but I don't necessarily regret it. You know, if something did happen, I could have had at least something backing me up saying I was fearing for my life and had, you know, whatever. And anyway, let's continue. I do some research on their festival and come across a far-right forum titled The Black Vault Hate Preserved, on which you need to make an account and be verified by a mod to have access to. It's not very hard to get verified on there, so I did. I got access to the forum, and the event was promoted in a post by the user Thorval, someone who has, as a profile picture and as a banner, the picture of Adrien Arcand, a Canadian Nazi and self-proclaimed Canadian Führer who created the Nazi Party of Canada in 1934. On Thorval's profile, he quotes Arcand: "The greatest catastrophe of modern times was Germany's defeat in 1945. By the way, when I got verified by a mod, I had to tell them I was a Nazi. So, for the first time in my life, I was able to say I was a Nazi online, but do it morally. Oof! Oh, I got chills. Okay, so the harmless Instagram DM aimed at provoking me was cute, but the overtly Nazi ideology, the online promotion of this event as a Nazi event, and the threat escalation meant that these fascists were willing to use violence or threaten it, which is an inherent characteristic of fascism, as we'll also see later. So I decided to do something about it with some other friends. Again, not wanting to give them attention, as it's exactly what they're seeking, the strategy we opted for was to organize our own anti-fascist music festival a weekend before theirs to cast them in our shadow, without ever mentioning their festival. And we had an edge. We weren't fascist losers who had to hide, so we were able to talk about our event in the media, get a huge venue with the city of Chandler, who were happy to have a family-friendly festival focused on diversity, inclusion, love, and solidarity. At that point, I learned who was organizing the event. As I'll explain later, they claim that they're not fascists, that they're playing a fictional character, and they threatened to sue me for defamation, so to avoid any problems, I'll call them fascist adjacent, since their music obviously appeals to fascists, as we'll see later. We're going to look into the music, don't worry. Anyway, the 7 people who contacted me on Instagram and the threatening caller all of whom labeled the festival far-right, might have been confused. Maybe the organizers never intended it to be far-right. Despite the overwhelming evidence of this event being far-right, I will either call it fascist adjacent or allegedly far-right because I'm being super good faith right now and leaving the audience to draw their own conclusions. Draw them. Take a piece of paper. Draw your conclusions. Go ahead. Send them to me on Instagram. I'll make a collage. So the fascist-adjacent organizers decided to create their own family-friendly festival at the same time as ours, this one free on the city's venue as well. They even created a poster looking exactly like ours. So we contacted the city saying that they can't organize two festivals on their premises at the same time, and that our initiative was being sabotaged by people who didn't like our focus on diversity, inclusion, love, and solidarity. Now, the director of culture of the city of Chandler, a childhood friend of the fascist-adjacent event organizer, was made aware that our festival had political and militant implications. As if a festival on diversity, inclusion, love, and solidarity isn't already political, but we're not talking to the smartest people, okay? We're not. Meanwhile, scandal in our little town.
Des croix gammées ont été dessinées à cet endroit cette semaine. La ville doit encore une fois dénoncer les méfaits.
Toujours le même message qui revient chaque année, malheureusement. On dit que c'est l'argent du peuple donc, qui est gaspillé, qui est chaud poubelle. Ça revient, malheureusement. On est très déçus de ça.
Nazi graffitis made with a Sharpie are found on our pedestrian bridge. The local television network calls me for a reaction, which I give. I'm actually dressed up right now as Sean in that interview. While the mayor makes the statement that vandalism is bad because it costs taxpayers money, Jesus Christ. I tell the media that the rise of fascism is particularly worrying now that it's in our city, and we can't help but to link this to an allegedly far-right festival whose bands feature swastikas in their logo. I told you, we'll get back to that soon. This was my way of warning the city of the alleged far-right festival happening in Chandler, to ring the alarm, the alerta antifascista. I give the journalist an interview, things go fine, he makes a pun calling Schindler's List Chandler's List, which I was very jealous of not coming up with myself, and he asks me how to get in contact with the allegedly far-right event organizer. By the way, the organizer's nickname, according to Metal Archives, is Maestro Holocausto. At least it's one of his nicknames. I was later told that Maestro Holocausto is a fictional character, a work of art that doesn't reflect the opinions and views of the artist behind it. From now on, I will refer to the allegedly far-right event organizer, a mouthful, as Maestro Holocausto, because it has a better ring to it. But for legal reasons, I must reiterate that Maestro Holocausto is a fictional character and that the far-right, Nazi or fascist element to it is alleged. So to the journalist who asked me to get Maestro Holocausto's contact information, I said, first, that I didn't have his information, which is true, and second, even if I had it, I wasn't about to give him a platform with local news. Why the fuck would I do that? In any case, the journalist does journalism, gets Maestro Holocausto's address, and knocks at his door for an interview. The journalist then calls me to say that everything is chill, that it was all a misunderstanding, and that Maestro Holocausto isn't actually far-right, he's just being provocative, and that, anyway, the official police communication states that there is no link between Maestro Holocausto's festival and the Nazi graffiti. Everything is fine, journalistic rigor helped us get to the bottom of it, and there's nothing to worry about. So I explained to the journalist that, of course, if Maestro Holocausto was a Nazi, he wouldn't say he's a Nazi. Of course, he would use provocation or irony, or as I'd learn later, fictional characters, as a way to get plausible deniability when confronted. We'll see this later as well. This is a widely studied and documented fact. The journalist told me that, of course, I probably know more about this topic, but that he was just reporting the news, not doing a research or a journalistic investigation. To the fact that the police said there was no link between the graffiti and the festival, I told him that I say there is a link, so which narrative will he take? He said that as a journalist, he needs to report on facts and that the evidence for a link between the two events are circumstantial. So I asked him what evidence the police provided to say that there is no link between Maestro Holocausto and the swastikas in a town of 7,500 people. The journalist said, it's what the police said. Oh, so they don't get to provide evidence. I guess the media just parrots the official narrative. North Korea ass motherfucker. I hung up, frustrated, of course. Anyway, the police should have said that they couldn't link both events together instead of saying that there was no link. But incompetent policemen and incompetent journalists, who's surprised? We're also going to talk about that later. So to go back to Maestro Olacosto's childhood friend, who happens to be the director of culture of the city of Chandler, he tells us that he's uncomfortable with the militant nature of the event, that we need to take the tiny Antifa logo off our poster, that he wants a copy of every speech that will be said during the event, that he doesn't want Chandler to position itself between the two extremes here being the Nazis and the anti-Nazis, and that, finally, if journalists knock again at Maestro Olacosto's door, they will definitely cancel our festival. They basically accused me of giving Maestro Olacosto an interview with the news, as if I could ever benefit from that. But we're not dealing with the smartest people here, are we? One thing the mayor of Chandler and Maestro Olacosto's friend did guarantee us is that if the allegedly far-right festival was happening in a building owned by the city, which it was, they'd cancel it. They agreed that the allegedly far-right festival was problematic enough to not host it. Considering the unreasonable conditions set for our event, and considering they'd cancel the allegedly far-right festival anyway, we decided to not organize ours on the city's premise and just do it in an empty field. Turns out the mayor, who when he sees swastika graffiti is more concerned about taxpayers' money than about Nazism, and Maestro Olacosto's friend, to us. The festival still happened in a city building, but we can at least rest assured that their allegedly far-right festival was gutted of any far-right political content, which I'll take as a win. Not a victory, but certainly a win. Now, the story could end there, right? Well, it doesn't. I get an email from Maestro Olacosto himself, threatening to sue me for defamation, but before telling you about it, let me show you his work. By the way, all this information is publicly accessible online, so there's no grounds for defamation because, anyway, Maestro Olacosto is a fictional character. I will not divulge the name of the artist behind Maestro Olacosto. Also, if this ever comes up in court, the sources for the information I'm about to share come from a document denouncing Maestro Olacosto that circulated in the community. In it, there are many links to a website called Metal Archives, which archives metal music projects. And I know there are some of my screenshots in said document, but those are screenshots I sent to my friends, who then shared them on their end. I did not make that document, I do not know who made it, and I legally disavow it. Anyway, he has this project called Musgut, which has a swastika in the logo. He changed said logo on the poster for the allegedly far-right festival, probably to make it more marketable. He also has the project called Aufnorden, a German Nazi term according to Wiktionary, meaning to Nordicize or make more Nordic. The first album I could find on Metal Archives by Aufnorden was made in 2022 and was titled Unter dem Schnee Hoffe, meaning under the snow, hope, on top of a swastika covered in snow. Very subtle. The second song of said album is titled Die Kanadische Verräter. I have no idea how I'm pronouncing this, but it feels German enough. That means the Canadian traitors, which I can only assume is a reference to World War II. Maestro Krugmar is another project with such songs as Algiz, Protect and Defend, Algiz being the name of a Nazi ruin as described by the ADL. There's also the song Hate Will Triumph. In 2021, he released a song titled In the Gangrene and the Judean Microbes, Immigrant Blood, and Panzer Attack, Panzers being German tanks used by the Nazis. In 2018, he released the songs Maestro Olacosto and Let's Clean the Streets, which I can only assume isn't about doing community service in our streets. Also, there's what appears to be Maestro Olacosto posing in front of a black sun, a neo-Nazi symbol. I can't be accused of exposing this information in bad faith. I even censored the person's face on there. Anyway, Maestro Olacosto sent me an email saying that I don't understand his ultra-controversial artistic process. He insisted that his projects are fictional characters and that they don't reflect his real convictions and ideas, and that, therefore, to call him a Nazi, fascist, or far-right is defamation. He said that he's infiltrating the far-right metal scene to change it, and that people like me are trying to control everything out of fear or a lack of thought. I'm stupid. He also answered to my rhetorical device of calling back to how our grandparents didn't sacrifice themselves in Normandy fighting fascists for their sons and daughters to become fascists themselves. His answer was, what about Russia? I don't know about you, but if I say Nazis are bad and you answer, well, what about Stalinists? I may not know if I'm talking to the real you or to your fictional Nazi alter ego. Anyway, anarchists were some of the very first critics of authoritarian communism and were also some of its very first victims. Less than a year into the Russian Revolution, Bolsheviks arrested and executed anarchists. I am an anarchist. I don't like the USSR. He told me to never forget that totalitarianism can come from the left, and that I'm welcome to live in Chandler, but that I can't decide who is good and who is bad. That next time I should talk to him about it because following this diabolical crusade, many people are suffering from it. The idea that Antifa is totalitarian or the real fascists is quite widespread, and we'll address that later. Also, the idea that exposing public Nazi projects, which is legal by the way, fictional or not, is also a very important point that we'll get back to later. Anyway, he then threatens to sue me if I keep spreading lies about him. I never did. However, if the person is serious about doing Nazi music to secretly infiltrate the far-right music scene, I publicly apologize to the artist behind the fictional character of Maestro Holocausto. But I do not apologize to Maestro Holocausto, the fictional character. By the way, this whole YouTube channel is also a fictional character. Like, I'm playing a role, so that way, you can't hold me accountable for anything that I say. Plausible deniability for anything. No consequences for any shit that I say. Siamo tutti antifascisti. If you want to become a member of Antifa, one thing you have to learn is our slogans and chants. The first one, my personal favorite, is Siamo tutti antifascisti. Repeat after me. Siamo tutti antifascisti. Here's how you chant it. Siamo tutti antifascisti!
Siamo tutti antifascisti! Siamo tutti antifascisti! Siamo tutti antifascisti!
What it means is we are all anti-fascist. It's a call for anti-fascist solidarity, claiming that everyone is, in a way, anti-fascist, as in everyone hates Nazis. You may disagree with some Antifa tactics, but you probably agree with its goal: to stop fascism. We are all anti-fascists also implies that if you don't oppose fascism, if you are okay with it existing, you are kinda siding with it. Most people agree that a world without fascists would be a better world. Now, which tactics should we use to get rid of them and how to identify them is another debate. So in this broad anti-fascist idea that a world rid of fascists is a better world, you can find two broader categories: liberal or non-militant anti-fascism and militant or activist anti-fascism. And both, at best, see each other as complementary or, at worst, strongly disagree. There's a good quote which illustrates this disagreement. The Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action. I wonder what kind of radical would say that. Liberal anti-fascism. First things first, this won't be the first time I mention liberalism in this video. I'm referring to liberalism here as a political philosophy, not to the ridiculous way Americans use it, which just means on the left of Republicans. Even the far-right report, Antifa, What Americans Need to Know About the Alt-Left, recognizes this. In the American context, liberal is often a catch-all term for members of the political left. However, throughout most of the world, liberalism refers to an ideology that embraces free market capitalism, either laissez-faire or restricted by a welfare state, property rights, and freedom of speech, assembly, and association. Furthermore, liberals accept the legitimacy of the government to defend these rights and basic institutions and respect the rule of law. As we'll see, anarchists and Antifa by extension agree with many liberal notions such as democracy, a skepticism of the state, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly and association, but it also sees a fundamental contradiction within liberal ideology. We'll see this later, but Antifa will argue that if you're going to keep the inequalities inherent to capitalism, you cannot guarantee the rights and freedom you supposedly cherish. This is important to understand Antifa, but again, that's for later. So back to our liberal anti-fascists. Sometimes things are better shown on a spectrum than in a binary. I love being non-binary, so let's make a spectrum between fascism and anti-fascism. So if you have militant fascists here and militant anti-fascists over there, then liberal anti-fascists are right here. By the way, the middle is a child with no opinions or grasp on any political concepts, so don't even think of being a centrist. So the militant anti-fascists and the militant fascists, these are the people going in the streets. They're the ones proudly and loudly advocating for their sides. If militant fascists, for example, believe that Jews are trying to replace them,
Jews will not replace us! Jews will not replace us!
a Nazi conspiracy theory called the Great Replacement Theory, all of anti-fascism will disagree. However, they will disagree differently, and that's where we can locate Antifa. On this spectrum, we'll add two scales that go from 0 to 10 for the threat perception of fascism and the level of engagement in the anti-fascist fight. We'll also add a category for tactics. So your average normie anti-fascist, right here, isn't really overtly political. They just oppose fascism in a super passive way. They may be against it because of history, because they've seen Inglourious Bastards, or simply because it's the default belief. Fascism is bad in and of itself, no more thoughts beyond that. They will disagree with the Great Replacement Theory, for example, because they think it's obviously wrong, because it's ridiculous, because those are wacky conspiracy theories, like when Trump said that Haitian immigrants were eating dogs.
They're eating the dog. They're eating the cat.
The solution is to simply ignore it, to dismiss it, or even to laugh at it, as you would with QAnon shit. What's up with that, by the way? What happened to Q? So to normies, the threat level is low, maybe between 1 and 3, and same goes for the level of engagement. The tactics are basically just to ignore. Right there, to ignore. Anyway, if you go a bit to the right between normie and militant anti-fascists, that's where you'll find liberal anti-fascism. Unlike the normie, their anti-fascism is more overtly political. Their belief is that fascism is both factually and morally wrong. However, the morality of it won't just be a default position as it is for the normies, who simply believe that fascism is bad in and of itself. Their beliefs that fascism is wrong will be rooted in the specific effects of fascist rhetoric. For example, saying that Jews are plotting to replace the white race isn't only ridiculous, it's bad. There's a moral character attributed to ideas, which, therefore, comes with a willingness to oppose it. In general, they're more casual about their anti-fascism and ultimately believe that fascism should be fought through discussion and debate on the marketplace of ideas. We need to fight fascism with harsh, stern words. This is not normal, they'll say. They may share Facebook posts about Trump being a fascist, they may read a book, or even better, watch a YouTube video on what fascism is. They may vote as a way of fighting or even campaign for a liberal candidate. They'll go to protests, but only peaceful protests, perhaps wearing pink hats with cat ears. They'll engage in everyday anti-fascism, meaning that they may challenge people around them who voice fascistic opinions or ideas. Everyday anti-fascism requires nothing more than some type of public expression of opposition to fascist ideology or activity. You probably have an idea of someone who fits this category. If you thought a white woman, we have the same biases. Usually, anti-fascist liberals aren't necessarily activist. Their ideas are some of many that rarely translate into action, like sharing Facebook posts. If anti-fascist liberals are activists, it's within the liberal framework. Again, at best, they'll vote, protest peacefully, sign petitions, debate, advocate, but all in all, they remain confined in the liberal logic of combating fascist rhetoric in the marketplace of ideas. Ultimately, they believe in the system, in our institutions, in our collective rationality, and in our elite. If the fascists say that the Jews will replace us, your answer, your way to fight it as a liberal anti-fascist, is to bring convincing, rational arguments to the table and spread them as much as possible. That way, fascists will either stop being fascists, or at the very least, people won't find fascism appealing because it was shown to be obviously wrong. Anti-fascist liberals who defend free speech for fascists may believe that fascist ideas are harmful, but that ultimately, if a majority doesn't adhere to these ideas, they are not dangerous. Harmful interpersonally, of course, but not dangerous in and of themselves. Many of them oppose fascism because it's illiberal. They'll oppose fascism because it threatens freedom of speech, for example, so for them, opposing fascism in an illiberal way, meaning outside the liberal framework, would be hypocritical. To them, if you oppose fascism because it's illiberal, then you can't be illiberal when you oppose it. So liberal anti-fascists may position themselves between a 3 and a 7 on the perceived threat level and on the level of engagement, and their tactics are contained within a liberal framework. They want to fight fascism through debate and reason. They'll even criticize more militant anti-fascists if they use illiberal means. Hence, when militant anti-fascists suppress the speech of fascists, liberal anti-fascists alongside fascists may say that Antifa are the real fascists. One of my favorite passages in Mark Bray's book is a short but incisive refutation to that idea. Liberals imagine themselves as guardians of free speech and therefore attack the illiberal politics of anti-fascism by folding it into the illiberal politics of fascism. If your main objection to Nazism is its suppression of the meetings of the opposition, then that says more about your politics than about those you're critiquing. Anti-fascists don't oppose fascism because it's illiberal in the abstract, but because it promotes white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, ultranationalism, authoritarianism, and genocide. Which brings us finally to militant anti-fascism. Militant anti-fascists not only believe that fascism is bad and harmful, but also dangerous. Any manifestation of fascism is the germ of a possible movement. Mussolini started with 100 members, Hitler with 54. Hence, as we'll see later, militant anti-fascists see any kind of fascist presence as an existential threat to be squashed. Militant anti-fascists are activists, so they organize protests and counter-protests, they'll distribute anti-fascist leaflets and disseminate information about fascism, they'll put up anti-fascist posters, stickers, and do graffiti. They'll organize events, do anti-fascist art, or even take on anti-fascism as an identity, wearing Antifa pins and patches, for example. Now, most of these things a liberal anti-fascist could do. Aside from the graffiti part, none of these tactics are illegal or contradict the liberal framework liberal anti-fascists operate within. However, many militant anti-fascists become militant because they don't believe liberalism does a good job at preventing fascism from emerging and taking root. As we'll see, partly because fascism isn't rational and explicitly appeals to irrationality, the liberal defense of fighting fascism through rational debate crumbles. Hence, most militant anti-fascists aren't only activists, but are illiberal activists, meaning they're willing to use tactics, as we'll see, that don't necessarily respect the free speech imperative, or that may even resort to violence. Many militant anti-fascist tactics are aimed on a community level, because that's the level on which anti-fascist militants operate. These tactics include taking down fascist posters, stickers, or covering fascist graffiti, tactics which are illiberal because they are aimed at silencing ideas rather than debate them. To illustrate this, a liberal wouldn't take down a Nazi poster. They would place a poster next to it to explain why Nazism is bad. These tactics can also include doxing, as we'll see later, trying to cancel events by calling the event's host, organize a counter-protest, not only to show disagreement with fascists, but to drown them out and prevent them from disseminating their ideas, etc. In short, the difference between anti-fascist liberals and militant anti-fascists is one of level of engagement and of tactics, which are proportional to the level of perceived threat fascism poses. And again, I'm presenting this as a spectrum. You may have liberal anti-fascists who share the same level of urgency and engagement as illiberal anti-fascists, but only disagree with tactics. These three categories aren't fixed. They're just areas of reference on a spectrum. Militant anti-fascist tactics can therefore be very confrontational. It has no tolerance for fascists and gives them no leeway. Ignoring them, as normies do, or trying to reason with them, as liberals do, is not mandatory or even responsible. Fascism, Buenaventura Durruti says, as quoted at the beginning of Mark Bray's book, is not to be debated. It is to be destroyed. By the way, this model, which is purely my invention, meaning I take full responsibility if you think it's good and useful, or if you think it's bad and oversimplifying politics, this model is one which pretty much only applies to the modern anti-fascism to fascism spectrum. It would be hard, for example, to place World War II veterans in it. People who fought fascists during World War II believed that fascism was, well, dangerous, obviously. And through the fact they'd risk their lives to fight it, their level of engagement and tactics they used would put them alongside militant anti-fascists. However, though using their fight as a mythological tool for Antifa can be useful, World War II veterans are not proto-Antifa. As La Horde says, that would entail that Stalin's Russia, the United States and its racial segregation, and the United Kingdom and its colonial empire were Antifa. They were not. Many soldiers who fought in the international brigades against Franco's fascists in 1936, soldiers who were ideologically against fascism and not just supporting their country in a war, were actually perceived as suspicious in their own country, and their enrollment in the army during World War II was made more difficult. Anyway, if you haven't figured it out yet, Antifa, as we understand it, situates itself here. Antifa is militant anti-fascism. Your average Democrat who positions themselves here is technically anti-fascist, but not Antifa, at least in my conceptualization of it. I hope this helps. What even is fascism? Well, I made a video about it. It's like 2 hours long, so go watch it. But what is fascism according to Antifa? Now, that's a good question. To far-right propagandists, fascism is what Antifa calls everything it disagrees with. This is simply not true. Anarchists disagree with anarchists all the time, yet don't call each other fascists. Yes, you can quote me on that. So how does Antifa actually use the term fascism? Mark Bray identifies two of the many registers of anti-fascism: analytical and moral. The analytical register consists of mobilizing historically informed definitions and interpretations of fascism to craft anti-fascist strategies suited to the specific challenges of facing ideologically fascist groups and movements. Methods of confronting neo-Nazi groups may not make sense against other far-right formations. Understanding the difference between them should inform strategic and tactical choices. The moral register developed out of the rhetorical power of the fascist epithet of calling someone or something a fascist in the post-war period. It comes into play when the anti-fascist lens is applied to phenomena that may not be fascist, technically speaking, but are fascistic. Hence, you'll have two approaches. Some Antifa activists will be pretty adamant on sticking to a precise and accurate definition of fascism, as, for example, the one I proposed in the video I made on the subject. It is often a more theoretical or even scholarly one, such as the one proposed by Robert Paxton. A form of political behavior marked by obsessive preoccupation with community decline, humiliation, or victimhood, and by compensatory cults of unity, energy, and purity, in which a mass-based party of committed nationalist militants, working in uneasy but effective collaboration with traditional elites, abandons democratic liberties and pursues with redemptive violence and without ethical or legal restraints goals of internal cleansing and external expansion. The analytical approach argues that understanding your enemy is essential in adopting appropriate tactics to defeat it, and that, therefore, using the right language, the right concepts, is essential. It was with this approach that I made my video on fascism. However, in this video, I want to take the moral approach. By the way, I don't think both these approaches are mutually exclusive. In some cases, understanding and discussing the nuances between the terms far-right, fascism, Nazism, neo-Nazism, alt-right, and other variants can be important, but in other cases, it can create unnecessary friction. This change in my approach to the concept of fascism came while reading 10 Questions on Anti-Fascism by La Horde, a book written by a collective of activists instead of scholars. From their perspective, their fight doesn't limit itself to fascism anyway. They much prefer labeling their fight as a fight against the far right. The use of the label Antifa or anti-fascism refers to a long tradition of fighting bigotry and perhaps serves as a reminder of the results of far-right political projects in 20th century fascism. This, to me, is very convincing since anti-fascism isn't only against fascism, it's against every form of right-wing extremism. Some Antifa activists interviewed by Bray insisted on the different tactics required to fight different types of far-right extremists, which I'm not really convinced by. Every situation, whether you live in a city or in a rural area, whether the fascist you're targeting is popular or not, will require different approaches. I don't know if the fact that your fascist is a Nazi, a white supremacist, a Klan member, or whatever really changes that much. La Horde defines the far right as simply being a political current that advocates a fundamentally unequal view of relationships between predefined groups of individuals involving systems of domination of one group over another, with these unequal relations established primarily according to ethnic criteria, our own people before others, and gender. Women are in the service of men. They then identify 5 ideological pillars of the far right to defend their vision of the world. Racism. Whereas racism was primarily framed as the right of a race to dominate another in previous iterations of far-right ideology, today it's rhetorically framed as defensive. The use of the term white genocide or the Great Replacement theory, which I've mentioned earlier, are examples of advocating for a defensive racism rather than an offensive one. Though there definitely was a component of victimization to historical fascism, I'd argue that it's a lot more central to the contemporary far right. There are 3 aspects to racism according to La Horde. First, to relativize or even deny structural racism or even a nation's historical racism. That may manifest itself in narratives about your country by, for example, minimize the place slavery or colonialism had in its history. 2, La Horde identifies Islamophobia, which they insist on it not being a criticism of Islam, but the framing that Islam represents different threats. The threat to security because Muslims are associated to terrorism, to liberty and identity because Muslims wear scarves and eat halal, or just in general that there's an incompatibility between Muslim cultures and Christian cultures. This may be a little less present in the United States than it is in Europe. I'm not saying that it's not present in the United States. There was literally a Muslim ban in 2017, but it's not as present in the United States rhetoric as it is in European rhetoric. But the United States may still push the rhetoric of immigrants not being compatible with United States culture, for example, by pushing conspiracy theories about Haitians eating people's cats and dogs. Cats and dogs. 3, victimization. Proponents of far-right politics always victimize themselves, not necessarily in terms of class, but in terms of race. They are, in this new woke world, oppressed because they're white. They see this oppression individually through DEI policies, for example, but also collectively with the aforementioned Great Replacement theory. Sexism. The victimization isn't only reserved to white people according to proponents of far-right politics. In this new woke world, men are also the victims of oppression. More specifically, straight men. Not only are traditional gender roles and stereotypes being subverted, women are being emancipated, which for various reasons to sexists means men are being devalued, but also the very concept of gender is being questioned. That's scary. Nationalism. The concept of nation became an exclusionary category, one that allowed to differentiate us and them, a way to fracture the working class and its revolutionary potential. In a world of increasing individuality due to capitalism, the idea of belonging to a large national community situated on a specific territory, blood and soil vibes, can be very appealing. Traditionalism. Traditionalism is all about wanting to reproduce the past without questioning it, sometimes even glorifying it. The past can have an authority as, through nostalgia, it may project a sense of stability and security, and it can also have the authority of some kind of natural order which recent changes may have subverted. Finally, authoritarianism. Through law and order rhetoric, authoritarianism doesn't need to be dictatorial. You can have authoritarianism spring from democracies through legalistic means, as did Hitler and Mussolini, or have authoritarianisms evolving and being practiced within liberal democratic boundaries and structures. The inegalitarian far right, especially when they pretend to be libertarian, will argue that egalitarianism, the idea that everyone is or should be equal, leads to authoritarianism. They see society plus equality equals authoritarianism, because you'll need an authority to enforce equality. Anti-fascists and leftists in general will argue that authoritarianism is actually the product of an egalitarian worldview. Humans plus inequality equals authoritarianism. Oh, this wasn't supposed to be there. That's for later. Anyway, if you don't look at that, it's the complete opposite argument. This is where it comes in. An inegalitarian worldview defends the idea that the equality is unnatural. Introducing equality requires force. Now, an egalitarian worldview defends the idea that inequality isn't natural. Introducing inequality requires force. This is because no matter what kind of inequality there is, either social, economic, or political, there will be contestation, there will be resistance to it. The history of the world is a history of resistance to inequality. If proponents of far-right politics want national unity, as they very often call for, it's one where the powerless which inevitably exist within their worldview need to be silenced. Now that's authoritarianism. While they believe that equality being unnatural would require force to exist, we believe that inequality is unnatural and is currently being maintained by force. We seek to fight that force. Which brings us to the fundamental differences between the far right, or fascism, I'll use both interchangeably in this video, and Antifa, which is mostly far left, as we'll see very soon. And because both movements are radical, they can often be equated. This is what the city of Chandler did when we told them we didn't want Nazis to organize a festival in our city. They didn't want to associate with any extremes. Any extremes is bad to the enlightened centrist, or to someone who has absolutely no clue of what's going on. However, to be able to equate racists and anti-racists, fascists and anti-fascists, sexists and anti-sexists, you need to be able to not feel involved in those discussions. Of course, a white man may see racists and anti-racists as extremists because he sees two groups fighting over political opinions, believing that not being too political or too militant is a virtue. But not only is it easy to stand by and do nothing when your material conditions don't require you to be too militant, but seeing your inaction as a virtue puts you at odds with the goals of anti-racists, as it implies that their militancy is not virtuous. How does it go again? The Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action. To see people fighting against racism or fascism and perceive them as radical or extreme says more about your politics than theirs. To equate both fascism and anti-fascism, centrists are falling for the horseshoe theory. Proponents of horseshoe or fishhook theory asserts that the far right and far left have greater similarity than difference. Such proponents and perceptions reflect a superficial examination of both anti-fascist and fascist movements, often devoid of in-depth understanding and analysis of either movement's ideology or structure. As I've added, it also betrays a lack of skin in the game. Whoa, that's actually a really good pun because it refers to skin color. Sometimes I can be so funny without realizing. So centrists who see any politics on the extremes as equivalent forget or are just ignorant of the fact that, first, both are in opposition to one another, and second, that both, though they are illiberal and criticize liberalism, which is the subject of the next chapter, they both do it from two very distinctive angles which determine the morality and consequences of both. Here are two examples which help distinguish both movements. How to identify an outgroup, and how they use the strategy of doxing. Let's start with how they identify an outgroup. This is something PhilosophyTube does great in her video on anti-fascism. She explains that the people Antifa fights are people who have racist, sexist, homophobic, or just generally bigoted ideas. These ideas, these people, can change. I opened my video on fascism by saying that I was a fascist. The Antifa criticism of fascists is one of ideas and behavior. However, the far right is criticizing its opponents on the basis of immutable characteristics: race, nationality, gender, sexual orientation, and sexual identity. If you're not white, you can't change that. The existence of the far right is incompatible with the existence of minorities. While the far right's war is one which will require the domination, subjugation, or elimination of some groups, Antifa's war requires to drop the belief in the domination and subjugation of some groups. I'm afraid that's not the same thing. Doxing. I was planning on mentioning this in the chapter reserved to tactics, but since doxing is a tactic used by both the far right and Antifa very differently, I think it's an important example to illustrate the differences between the movement and its counter-movement. Because Stanislav Vysotsky does such a great job at explaining the practice of doxing and its aims by Antifa activists, here's an excerpt from American Antifa, the Tactics, Culture, and Practice of Militant Antifascism. The practice of doxing, as performed by militant antifascists, involves the public dissemination of personal information such as the name, photograph, personal phone number, address, and employer of fascists, along with a descriptive narrative about the individual's activism in the supremacist movement. These types of campaigns often come with a call to pressure employers and landlords to cut their ties with fascist activists. This pressure is sometimes accompanied by protests at or near fascist homes or workplaces that are designed to increase pressure and mobilize social stigma. The tactic of outing or doxing serves multiple strategic goals for militant antifascists. The information regarding fascists is part of a broader campaign to inform communities about the extent of fascist activity that they face in order to motivate oppositional activism. The educational component in this case is also designed to marshal public pressure on supremacists in order to increase the cost of participation consistent with counter-movement dynamics. Or, as the slogan of One People's Project states, hate has consequences. Eowyn explained that public pressure has the potential to motivate fascists to disengage from activism. Letting their neighbors, bosses, and everyone else know that they are involved with hate groups might be enough to make them back off. While the Trump era has brought fascist discourse and mobilizing into the public eye, there remains a great deal of stigma associated with overt expressions of bigotry typical of supremacist movements. Exposing fascists to the public forces them to confront the activist stigma of their identity and reckon with the consequences of their movement involvement. Landlords, employers, and the broader community are also put in a position to be able to proactively repudiate fascist activism and ideology. Doxing, therefore, serves as a means of pressuring fascists to make a choice between their ideological position and engaging with normative familial, work, and social activities. By encouraging community mobilization in opposition to the fascism in its midst, such campaigns also contribute to building a broader culture of anti-fascism. Antifa doxes in order to out their target as fascist and make them suffer the social consequences of being a fascist, which range from stigmatization to unemployment. Now, why do fascists dox? If they make an Antifa activist's information public, it's not to make them suffer the social consequences of being Antifa. I am very openly Antifa in a way that, if I was a fascist, I couldn't be. While people may disagree with militant anti-fascist tactics, an Antifa identity simply doesn't carry the kind of stigma that comes with being an avowed bigot. Flyering campaigns, therefore, serve to put Antifa activists on notice that fascists know where they live and work, and that they must beware of potentially violent retribution. To Vysotsky, it's very clear. When fascists use doxing, it's as a threat. A bit earlier in the same chapter, he shows the difference between the use of violence by different social movements, including Antifa, and the use of violence by fascists. Whereas many social movements approach the use of violence as a strategic method to achieve an economic, political, or social goal, violence is a goal in and of itself for fascists. So hopefully, these two examples from the difference in determining an outgroup and the differences when applying a tactic such as doxing to even using violence as a method or as a goal shows how equating fascists and Antifa simply because they're extreme is an extremely fast and lazy intellectual shortcut. But there's another important component to be taken into consideration when criticizing ideas or ideologies simply because they are extreme. The centrist take that all extremisms are bad is one which lacks a tremendous amount of perspective and is easily taken down by uttering three simple words. Extremism is relative. If you're a centrist and you condemn every form of extremism, you have to condemn yourself, because you'd be an extremist to George Washington for wanting women to vote or for wanting to abolish slavery. You're an extremist to someone 200 years from now where eating meat is a crime. You don't need to compare yourself to someone from a different time. You're an extremist to a jihadist who believes that homosexuality should be punishable by death. You don't even need to compare yourself to an Islamist. If you still defend capitalism in a world where it's very obviously destroying the planet, you're an extremist to me. If you're a centrist and you condemn every form of extremism, you're not doing so objectively. You're doing it in a very specific context where the boundaries of what is determined as politically acceptable is defined by forces outside of your control. When you say you're against all forms of extremisms, what you're saying is, we should stay in a specific window within the left-right axis, which I believe is acceptable. And that window, whether you know it or not, has a name. Its name is Overton. The Overton window is the range of subjects and arguments politically acceptable to the mainstream population at a given time. The concept of Overton window helps us understand one of the roles of radical politics, which is to pull the window towards one side or another. Fascists seek to shift the Overton window of acceptable political debate to include the overtly racist and misogynist elements of their ideology. Visual campaigns of flyers, posters, and stickers introduce fascist talking points and imagery into communities. Public rallies and protests focus attention on the fascists as legitimate claims makers and stakeholders. Finally, mass media exposure facilitates broad fascist messaging to a wider audience of potential members and sympathizers. What centrists find acceptable and not extremist is what is within this window. However, this is often determined, or at least affected, by radical politics. When the Overton window was shifted to the left during the Civil Rights Movement or after Stonewall, that was led by radical leftists. When, in recent years, it's become more socially acceptable to be bigoted and say hateful and racist things, when that comes off as less extremist, it means the window has been shifted. Trump shared a video of the Obamas as monkeys 3 months ago, and sure, that was denounced, but not as denounced as it would have been 20 or 30 years ago. The window has been shifted. This is why Antifa is radically against the far right. When the Overton window shifts left, it emancipates people. When it shifts right, it creates hateful social climates. Who are the fascists? Siamo tutti fascisti? If siamo tutti antifascisti, if we are all anti-fascists, then who are the fascists? Conservatives, or fascists, will say Antifa claims everyone they disagree with of being fascists. So is everyone fascist or anti-fascist? Make up your mind, Antifa. So as we've seen, Antifa is against the broader coalition of far-right extremisms, not just fascism. For all intents and purposes, the latter are fascist, fascistic, or fascist adjacent. The Unite the Right rally was a great example of that coalition. You had libertarians, with their Don't Tread on Me flags, many Confederate flags, American flags, of course, Nazi flags, Klan members, etc. I'd argue that, though distinguishing them is important theoretically, I think for all practical reasons, it's okay to treat them as the same. The tactics and reasoning behind fighting the Klan and fighting Nazis aren't going to be very different. Okay, so as I was writing this script on the Unite the Right rally, MAGA is blowing up the fact that the Southern Poverty Law Center paid informants to gather intelligence, and particularly one informant who was allegedly one of the organizers of the Unite the Right rally. MAGA is now saying that the rally was organized by leftists. They may think that the people waving Nazi flags were leftists or that they were paid actors, but in any case, they're peddling this conspiracy theory to convince the American people that leftists need to make up racism in the United States for it to actually exist. You guys are very racist. We don't need to make it up. But what's really interesting about this is that I read a very similar argument in the far-right book on Antifa, which ties it with the idea that Antifa activists see everyone as fascist. There is an implied hatred of all white people as racists, against whom violence is justified. The list of enemies to be slaughtered and killed grows inevitably from members of actual fascist parties to supporters of the current president of the United States or people who don't support mass third world immigration. By definition, Antifa must have enemies that can be dehumanized as evil and dangerous. Otherwise, they lose their entire reason for existence. The framing of Antifa targeting innocent people by calling them fascists and racists solely because they're white or because they disagree with them is simply not true. Obviously. That sounds awfully like the kind of defense a fascist would come up with. It's similar to someone saying, "This anti-child molester gang who called me out for being a child molester is just roaming around accusing anyone of being a child molester. I promise." Don't clip that. Don't clip that. Anyway, the idea that some people actually believe a far-right propagandist when they say that Antifa targets anyone because they hate white people is absolutely ridiculous, but not that unbelievable. It's not unbelievable because there are chances that the far-right propagandist doesn't see themselves as far-right, and their audience may think, I've been called racist, although I'm not a racist, so I understand the struggle. I've talked about it in the intro to my video on fascism, but there's this idea that the terms racist, sexist, misogynistic, homophobic, transphobic, or fascist are simply terms to insult someone you disagree with, rather than being accurate descriptors of their actions and beliefs. These terms are socially perceived as bad, so we reject them when applied to us, because we obviously don't see ourselves as bad people. But even actual self-described racists and fascists don't see themselves as bad people either. If you watched my video on fascism, you'll know that fascists see themselves as defenders of the people, fighting off foreign invaders, fighting off degeneracy, and advocating for a stronger and more united nation. They see themselves as the good guys. If they defend Hitler, they don't defend Hitler thinking he was evil. They'll say he was right, that he was actually the good guy, that history was written by the victors, and the victors just framed Hitler. But Antifa usually know what they're talking about when they criticize the far right. If climate activists are obsessed with climate change and know a lot about it because they research it a lot, Antifa is obsessed with fascism and knows a lot about it because they research it a lot. If climate activists have eco-anxiety, Antifa activists have fascio-anxiety. All this to say, in a large majority of cases, Antifa doesn't just call anyone a fascist because they know what fascists and fascism are. They are anti-fascist because they've learned about fascism, because they know its logic and its practice, and they really don't like where it leads. And needless to say, fascism isn't just white people. At least, I don't think I said that in my video on fascism. Also, there's a lot of white Antifa. I think that's one of the criticisms the right has of it. But as the far-right book says, perhaps Antifa knows what fascism is, but falsely accuses people they disagree with of being fascists to justify their continuing existence. Institutions tend to want to self-perpetuate. Anarchists are particularly aware of that. When communists say that after a socialist revolution, the state will wither away as it becomes less and less needed, anarchists argue that the state, far from withering away, will want to consolidate its own power. However, Antifa doesn't have power to consolidate. Nobody has a job they want to keep in Antifa. Nobody has power and privileges that comes with Antifa, and nobody gains prestige from being in Antifa since its members are notoriously anonymous. There's no incentive or advantage to keep Antifa if there are no fascists. It's not like Antifa activists are running out of things to volunteer for. The fact is, Antifa doesn't call everyone they disagree with a fascist. And not only do they not fight with random white people just because they're white, they won't even fight with any fascist. If there's a fascist online with 2 Twitter followers who accuses Jews of wanting to replace white people, Antifa are not going to waste their time and resources fighting that person, trying to find where they live and dox them. If some random guy says something racist at an office party, Antifa is not going to show up at his door the next day. Let's go back to the model I made up. If some anti-fascists are not activists, the normies, or are even just anti-fascists by convention, I guess those levels of engagement can be reversed in the fascist camp. Now, of course, the far right doesn't advertise itself as far right because of the stigma that comes with it, so it's identifiable mostly through rhetoric which is sexist, queerphobic, and racist, but which won't appear as such. Let's talk about that actually. A popular far-right slogan in France is "France to the French." It doesn't say who the French are, but it implies white French people excluding immigrants. However, there's plausible deniability. If someone pushes back on you for saying France to the French, you can say, the French are whoever speaks French, or whoever was born here, including people of color. But what they really mean is France to white people. The thing is, even if open queerphobia and open sexism, especially more recently, are increasingly tolerated, open racism is still very unpopular. As we showed earlier, the KKK is, by far, the least popular movement for both Republicans and Democrats in the United States. Open bigotry is still stigmatized, at least for now. Since overt expressions of fascism and white supremacy are generally socially stigmatized, movement participants develop a complex series of ways to indicate their affiliation. This can be done through dog whistles, or signals which only the in-group understands. France to the French may be considered a dog whistle, but examples such as the 14 words are more blatant. If someone says the 14 words, most people will overlook or not be interested in whatever that means. But the 14 words are, we must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. A neo-Nazi slogan. Same goes for the JQ, which means the Jewish question, this can be applied to imagery too. There are many Nazi runes, such as the Algiz rune mentioned earlier, which seem like simple symbols, but which have Nazi meaning. To your average person, these don't mean anything, and if an Antifa activist tries to denounce these runes as fascist, they may come off as conspiratorial. Guys, I promise, this is fascism, okay? This is far right. This is race. Same goes for the black sun. It's a well-known Nazi symbol, but if you show it to people who don't know what it means, they won't get it, and they may think you're crazy for pointing it out. Pepe the Frog was at one point appropriated by the far right into a dog whistle, which tragically led to the creator, Matt Fury, to symbolically kill him in a comic strip to sever his ties with bigotry. Pepe was later resurrected after a after a Save Pepe campaign to reclaim Pepe as a positive figure. Pepe's abusive abduction by the far right also became iconic as he was mentioned in Richard Spencer's famous last words.
The neo-Nazi movement? It's Pepe's become kind of a symbol.
We'll get back to that. Pepe the Frog was part of a broader dog whistle strategy of using humor, not just for plausible deniability, but to push boundaries. As a fascist, you can make jokes about the Jews, about women, about black people to test boundaries, to see if the people you're talking to are on your side. If they aren't and call you out for your racist or sexist joke, you can fall back on the fact that it was just a joke, that leftists are sensitive, triggered, and that you really can't say anything these days. Anyway, let's quote Vysotsky again because I really loved his book. The approach to fascist signifiers, especially by the highly online alt-right, is to confound outsiders and signal to insiders using what they term as irony, although it is more realistically deniability. Images are deployed by fascists who then claim victimization by, and lack of sense of humor from, their detractors. This strategy is clearly evident in the use of the OK sign by fascist and far-right activists. Because of its innocuous use in the wider culture, its intentional use in far-right contexts can be denied as a hate symbol, yet its users routinely demonstrate fascist affiliations and are deliberately deploying it to signal their ideological position, ultimately serving as a movement signifier. Consistent with the metapolitical strategy of fascist movements that seek to impact cultural norms rather than political systems, individual subcultural identity serves to undermine what fascists perceive as a multicultural hegemony. Producing and consuming fascist subcultural products becomes the means by which resistance is enacted. Cultural construction and production, therefore, becomes the means through which certain activists within the movement contribute to the greater cause. Fascists have adopted the strategy of metapolitics, which abandons electoral politics, at least temporarily, to focus on reshaping culture with its norms, identity, and what is acceptable to say. We're back to the Overton window, aren't we? It's also tied to culture war stuff, which I may one day make a video about. It's tied to subcultures, which in this case, and in contemporary society more broadly, is maybe more applicable online. The strategy is not necessarily to provide one of many answers to a debate, as most ideologies do. The metapolitical strategy is to determine the parameters of the debate rather than its outcome. For example, if we're talking about trans rights, the left will advocate for legal recognition of gender identity, protection from discrimination, or healthcare access, just to give you some examples. Now, the far right could enter the marketplace of ideas and debate these points, but they know that won't be effective. They need to determine the parameters of the debate rather than just be part of it. And those parameters can be to frame the trans rights debate through issues of women's sports, for example. Conservatives don't care about women's sports, they don't even care about women. And as the National Collegiate Athletic Association president testified, there are fewer than 10 out of 510,000 athletes who are trans. Trans women in sports is an extremely marginal issue when compared, for example, to violence done against trans women. However, even though it's a marginal issue, it's an issue that trans activists won't make concessions on, as I rightfully think they shouldn't. When the right attacks trans women athletes, they're giving us no choice but to push back and therefore accept the parameters of the debate they've determined for us. When they frame the debate for us, we have no choice but to answer. When we frame the debate for them, either through the Epstein files, through wealth inequality, through pointing out corruption and incompetence, they can just ignore us. And that's exactly what they do. We can't ignore them, so we keep playing their game. We are always reactive, mostly because we care, we have values, morality, but that's not helping. That's my point. It's not helping. I don't have a solution to this, by the way. I just wanted to point out the strategies and dynamics at play here. Anyway, all this to say that fascists, far-right activists, Nazis, neo-Nazis will hide their ideas under a veneer of respectability because of the increasingly waning stigma associated with their ideas. They will disassociate themselves from the far right. They will wear suits and ties. They'll use euphemistic language. They will shift the Overton window through culture war rhetoric to make their ideas more palatable. So to go back to my fascist to Antifa spectrum model, which isn't perfect, of course, I'll position under fascist normies people who aren't particularly fascist but don't oppose them either. Right there. People who vote for far-right political figures, such as Trump, may do it because they're single-issue voters, the same way someone who voted for Mussolini because he made the trains run on time doesn't necessarily mean they agree with most things Mussolini advocated, which still means they voted for fascists, but doesn't necessarily mean they aligned themselves with fascist politics. However, they were fascistic enough to dismiss the negative consequences of supporting a fascist, consequences which are usually lived by other marginalized people. This is why they're on the fascist side. Then you have the far-right equivalent of liberals in the level of engagement with politics. They may have a MAGA hat, they may go to rallies and conferences, they may even receive emails by President Donald J. Trump telling them he loves them but needs their money. They're not mobilizing, they're not creating groups, they're not part of any groups, they're just supporters whose engagement with politics is limited and which is confined to traditional means, including sharing Trump posts online. Then you have militant fascists. Those are the people, just like Antifa, who engage with politics more aggressively. They may create or participate in far-right groups, organize conferences, do activism both online and in real life. They'll engage in meta-politics, as we've seen earlier. They'll also engage in illiberal tactics, direct action. They may organize militias, etc. Now, from my experience, Antifa mobilization targets these people. The militant fascists, those organizing and working actively to increase fascist ranks and popularity. PhilosophyTube frames the question in the context of Antifa activism, not as who is a fascist, but who is doing a fascism. The people who situate themselves under the fascist banner, but outside the militant fascism, so these people, are not the target of Antifa action. They're only targets insofar as we're trying to make them see that fascists are bad and unwelcome in our communities. Antifa activists understand that people swayed by fascist rhetoric are the victims of it. There are certain economic and social factors that can explain why you'd vote for Trump. If 1 in 5 Americans who voted Democrat have a high school diploma or less, it's 1 in 3 for Trump's Republicans. A majority of women voted for Harris, a majority of men voted for Trump. If 1 in 5 Americans who voted Democrats are under 29, it's 1 in 10 for Trump. If it's 1 in 4 who voted Democrat who are between 50 and 64, it's 1 in 3 for Trump. If 2 out of 3 who voted Democrat were white, it's 3 out of 4 for Trump. If 1 in 6 Americans who voted Democrat came from rural areas, it's 1 in 3 for Trump. Half of the people who voted Democrat were Christians. It was 3/4 for Trump. If you voted for Trump, if you fell for his rhetoric and you feel profoundly scammed because of Iran, because of gas prices, because of food prices, because of rent prices, because of ICE, because of his incompetence, because of Epstein, it's not your fault. This may sound very pretentious because it is, but had you grown in material conditions that would lead you to be a leftist, you would have seen that shit coming. In any case, anyone can change, and ultimately, Antifa's goal is to change people. The far right doesn't want to change people. They can't change people of color. They can't change queer people. We've mentioned this earlier when talking about the far right identities and outgroup. It's an inherent genocidal ideology, as PhilosophyTube demonstrates in her video on anti-fascism. So when the far right pamphlet on Antifa says there is an implied hatred of all white people, or that Antifa's list of enemies to be slaughtered and killed grows inevitably, it feels more like projection to me. So we looked at the fa in Antifa, or what Antifa opposes, and we looked at who that fa is. Antifa opposes fascism, obviously, and we'll later see in more details why that is. But first, I'd like to look at another ism opposed by Antifa, which is essential to its understanding. That ism isn't sexism or racism, it's reflected in a term that comes back in Antifa circles, the three-way fight. This three-way fight involves fascism, anti-fascism, and liberalism. If the state and its liberal ideology were effective at stopping fascism, radical leftists wouldn't have to do anything at all. Antifa wouldn't exist. Yet, as with many other aspects, liberalism fails. To understand why Antifa exists, we need to look at its criticisms of liberalism. Fucking liberals. Antifa emerges from the failures of liberalism as understood as the political philosophy that takes protecting and enhancing the freedom of the individual to be the central problem of politics. This means protecting individual rights and freedoms such as freedom of speech and democracy, property rights, and protection from violence. We'll be looking at these three elements and how anarchists, and by extension Antifa, criticize these concepts as deployed in a liberal framework. Before doing that, however, I think it would be worth it to define anarchism and why I frame Antifa as an anarchist movement. Anarchism. Surprise, surprise, I already made a video on anarchism, so if you're actually interested, go check it out. Wait, you didn't click off to go watch it? Fine, I guess I'll explain. In a nutshell, anarchists are against any form of domination and exploitation, against authority or hierarchy, so they reject and actively fight against the state and capitalism, which are the two ultimate forms of hierarchy and systematized domination, both feeding into each other. Capitalism exists to enrich a small minority at the expense of the majority, and the state exists to protect the power and interests of that small minority. Anarchists, therefore, organize horizontally in a decentralized and non-hierarchical way. They advocate for a communist society, but without a state, which has historically set them apart from authoritarian communists, as I've briefly mentioned at the beginning of this video. To learn more about anarchism, I strongly recommend you check an anarchist FAQ, which provides answers to many questions you may have on its ideas. If you ever don't like reading, yours truly has been working on an audiobook version of it for years now. We just started Section C. Now that you somewhat understand what anarchism is, at least as an anti-authoritarian leftist movement, we need to quickly look at the history of Antifa to understand why I'm calling it an anarchist movement. Fascism came to be in a time of socio-economic crisis where more and more workers were turning to communism for answers. Mussolini's fascists took power only 5 years after Russia's communist revolution. Revolutions were brewing all across the world, especially in Europe, and both Italy and Germany were bracing for one. The working class, an important demographic during elections, were turning away from traditional old aristocratic bourgeois parties and solutions. They were turning away from conservatism and capitalism. So the right, composed mostly of rich aristocrats, had to find a way to gain back their bleeding electorate. If they didn't, a revolution would take away their privileges. As I explained in my video on fascism, fascism came in and gave the right a breath of fresh air. It brought young dynamic militants who could mobilize people at a time of mass politics. This allowed the right to gain electoral support without giving in or conceding to communists. To steal the communist electorate, all you had to do was present yourself as radical. The only revolutionary or radical option at that time was communism. If you came in on the political landscape and advocated for radical changes while still protecting the interests of the wealthy, you could both get important financial backing and votes from dissatisfied electors looking for an alternative. Also, the Nazis more specifically were called National Socialists because they wanted to appeal to socialist voters, siphoning the communist electorate. But the anti-communism of fascism is even more apparent in their repression of communism. Both Nazis and Mussolini's fascists cracked down on unions and communists. Dachau is known as the first ever concentration camp. Its first prisoners were communists, social democrats, and trade unionists. Martin Niemöller, who initially was an anti-communist and anti-Semitic pastor who supported Hitler, to then oppose the Führer and be imprisoned in Dachau to be released in 1945 by the Allies, wrote a famous poem after the Nazi defeat titled First They Came. And you know who they came for first. It's the communists, then the socialists, then the trade unionists. But the first they came didn't only start when Hitler took power. Fascists had been fighting communists for their egalitarian or so-called Jewish ideology, while communists had been fighting fascists for being counter-revolutionary and siding with the wealthy. Mussolini's black shirts were particularly violent against communists, socialists, anarchists, and trade unions. So this is the context in which anti-fascism came to be. But that wasn't Antifa as we know it today. It's inspiring, it's myth-giving, but those anti-fascist actions often weren't independent, but tied to pre-existing political organizations. In Germany, the Antifascistische Action, the organization we got the double flags from, was under the control of the KDP, the German Communist Party. In Spain, the anti-fascist forces were in large part associated with the CNT, the anarcho-syndicalist union leading the anti-fascist anarchist revolution in Spain. In 1921 Italy, the Arditi del Popolo was founded, the first anti-fascist organization, which is the closest to what we imagine Antifa being, as they were a broad coalition of leftists opposing Mussolini, many of them being anarchists, or socialists and communists. However, the greater structures of the socialist and communist parties didn't support them, the socialists preferring a parliamentary solution, while communists didn't like it because it wasn't under party control. That's not a joke. Communists would demand their members to quit the Arditi del Popolo, the first ever anti-fascist organization, a year before Mussolini took power because they thought it undermined the party's authority and strategy. This, friends, is why anarchists don't like authoritarian communists. The Arditi del Popolo was decentralized, spontaneous, with local anarchistic autonomous groups, and with communists and socialists joining action despite what their parties told them. This makes the Arditi del Popolo more akin to what we think Antifa is today. However, the context in which they evolved, where fascists were often organizing in open violent militias, made the nature of their work very different to ours. Perhaps the origins of modern Antifa may be better identified in post-war anti-fascist organizations. Mark Bray opens his chapter about this history by telling the story of two Jewish cousins seeing this movie for the first time in 1945.
I, as a member of parliament with 9 others, visited Buchenwald concentration camp.
It shows images of Mavis Tate, a British MP, visiting the Buchenwald concentration camp. The horrors of the camps are shown graphically. There's no holding back, and they make a point of using these images as a warning for future generations. The short movie ends like this.
Let no one say these things were never real.
Morris Beckman and Harry Rose, two Jewish World War II veterans, watched this in 1945, the same year the war ended. As the two cousins left the theater that very day, they were shocked to hear yelled from atop a pedestal in the street, "Not enough Jews were burned at Belsen." Rose, still in his uniform and medals, complained to a nearby police officer who just shrugged his shoulders and walked away. Silly Rose, thinking the police would do anything about it. Rose wanted to do something, but Beckman held him back. Not long after holding back his cousin from attacking a fascist speaker, Morris Beckman and 3 fellow Jewish veterans came upon an outdoor meeting of the fascistic British League of Ex-Servicemen and Women. That day, Jeffrey Ham, formerly of the British Union of Fascists, was denouncing the aliens in our midst, who profited while our boys fought overseas. The Jewish veterans had enough. This group of 4, which included a judo expert formerly of the Welsh Guards, a former RAF pilot, Beckman, and another veteran, spread out into the crowd of 60. As the judo expert pretended to buy copies of the League newspaper, he suddenly smashed the heads of 2 fascist stewards together, and Beckman and the others toppled the stage, dispersing everyone. Beckman explained that the sheer malevolence of the speaker moved him and his comrades to physically shut down a post-war fascist meeting for the first time. It would not be their last. A little later, by 1949, the fascist threat had receded. A number of former Mosleyites, Oswald Mosley's fascists, had even become vocal anti-fascists. In part, this was because the fierce aggression of the anti-fascists made them depressingly aware that every time they showed their faces, they were going to be savagely attacked. For many, it was simply not worth it. In 1950, the 43 group disbanded, believing that their goal of stamping out Mosleyite fascism had been achieved, at least for the time being. First, I'd like to point out that this is an example of anti-fascists disbanding once a fascist threat wanes out, and second, this is a better historical example to illustrate the origins of modern Antifa. A group of friends sees some hateful public mobilizing and, knowing the state and the police won't do anything about it, they decide to take the matters into their own hands because they refuse to stand by while hate is used as a mobilizing tool. That's what my Antifa friends and I did in Chandler, minus the smashing heads and badass judo, and minus the being Jews a year after the Holocaust. That probably helped them to gain sympathy and support with the population as it understood the danger fascism represented. I guess it's a little less the case today. This little historical detour was made to illustrate how and why I'm calling Antifa an anarchist type of organization. Since the authoritarian communists dropped the ball in the 20th century, which anarchists predicted decades before the October Revolution, a lot of anti-fascist work, at least in the global north because that's what the literature I consulted focused on, was accomplished by anarchists, or at least anarchistically. For example, the Black Bloc tactic, which is often associated with Antifa, is an infamous tactic popularized by anarchists in the 90s. But beyond the similar aesthetics, direct action, and tactics shared by anarchists and anti-fascists, and beyond the fact that many anti-fascists, even more so in the US according to observations made by Brave, Vysotsky, and myself, are anarchists, there's one last aspect of it that makes it anarchist: its mode of organization. As we've seen historically with Proto-Antifa through the Arditi del Popolo and the example of anti-fascist action after the war in London, Antifa is decentralized, local, spontaneous, self-managed, democratic, and horizontal. As we've seen historically with Proto-Antifa through the Arditi del Popolo and the example of anti-fascist action after the war in London, Antifa is a decentralized, local, spontaneous, self-managed, democratic, and horizontal form of organization aimed at resisting the far right. For these reasons, I have no trouble calling it anarchist. Now we can look at the anarchist criticism of liberalism and see how it applies to Antifa. Fucking Liberals Part 2. In his 1938 book, Anarcho-Syndicalism Theory and Practice, the anarchist Rudolf Rocker described anarchism as the convergence of socialism and liberalism. Anarchism, he said, fulfills the ideals which liberalism promises but fails to deliver on: democracy, freedom, both individual and collective, opposition to authority, and a distrust of the state. According to anarchists, it is liberalism's stubborn insistence on defending the right to private property, the market, and capitalism which prevents it from achieving its own ideals. Liberalism and democracy were preeminently political concepts, and since the great majority of the original adherents of both maintained the right of ownership in the old sense, these had to renounce them. Democracy with its motto, all citizens equal before the law, and liberalism with its right of man over his own person, both shipwrecked on the realities of the capitalist economic form. One of the central concepts of liberalism is representative democracy. Representative democracy. As a supposed embodiment of the people, it is meant not only to defend its interests and those of the individuals who compose it, but also to guarantee their security and protect their rights and freedoms. In order to determine the interests of the people and of individuals, liberal representative democracies establish parliaments in which ideas are debated. It is through the exchange of ideas, their confrontation, and their resilience in the face of criticism that, through an almost Darwinian process, the best ideas, those most resistant to criticism, are ultimately retained. The principle, often referred to as the marketplace of ideas, where ideas are presented as competing commodities, lies at the heart of liberalism. The marketplace of ideas is embodied in parliamentary debate. It is central during elections when political parties sell their ideas, again as commodities, and more abstractly, it unfolds socially and culturally among individuals within society. So through the confrontation of ideas, whether in parliament, during elections, or among family and friends, we contribute to identifying the ideas most beneficial to the collective. From a strictly liberal perspective, social changes, from granting women the right to vote to civil rights in the United States, would be the product of debate and determined by a collective, deliberative process. This process not only creates a structure for rational decision-making, but also guarantees fundamental freedoms because they are necessary to sustain that structure. Notably, freedom of expression, which includes freedom of press, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, and so on and so forth. freedom of expression is essential to bring ideas into conflict, which allows not only for the identification of the best ideas, but also for the recognition and rejection of the worst. John Stuart Mill, a key figure of liberalism, develops this reasoning in his book On Liberty, where he argues that no form of opinion should be censored, since any opinion may be entirely true, partially false, or entirely false. If an opinion is entirely true, all the better. If it's partially false, it still has value because through reasoned debate, its elements of truth can be revealed. If it's entirely false, it is, of course, seen as bad, but first, it represents a price to pay for freedom of speech, and second, it helps to refresh and reinforce the reasoning behind our principles. In this way, ideas we consider true are prevented from becoming dogma, because being continually challenged by false opinions reminds us of the reasoning that supports them. Such is the reasoning behind the principle of freedom of speech. The state should not suppress any form of expression because the more absurd, false, or misleading an idea is, the more easily it will be rejected as such through reasoned public debate. Applied to the fight against fascism, liberalism therefore relies as its defense primarily on collective rationality, which is facilitated by selfless governments and neutral and rigorous media. However, anti-fascists raise several concerns about this liberal defensive strategy. 1. Its inability to identify and combat the roots of fascism. 2. Its bourgeois parliamentary system, which is anything but selfless or representative. 3. Its trust in rational debate. And 4. Its dogmatic commitment to freedom of speech. The roots of fascism: capitalism. Among the sources of fascism, Jonathan Durand-Foucault, in his book Fascisme Tranquille, identifies, among other factors, economic insecurity, the crisis of democracy, and colonial violence. We can throw in individualism into the mix, alienation, and a feel of general disempowerment. The context in which fascism has developed, both historically and today, is one exacerbated by, or even intertwined with, capitalism. Whether Antifa activists identify capitalism in crisis as the cause of fascism or as one of its central components, the two are inseparable. Liberalism, especially through its defense of the right to private property, strongly supports capitalism and thus the conditions necessary for the emergence of fascism. I could go on further into the link between capitalism and fascism, but I feel like we've seen enough of it in this video, and if you want to know more about it, I suggest you watch my video on fascism. 2. Representative democracy. Anyone who has a little bit of self-respect knows that we don't live in a democracy. I really like Francis Dupuy-Derry's characterization of our system as an elective aristocracy. I might one day make a video about that. Maybe. Even Jean-Jacques Rousseau was saying in 1762 that the Brits were fooling themselves if they thought their will was being represented in Parliament. I don't think I need to take out statistics to prove to you that our elected officials are in the pockets of billionaires or are themselves billionaires. And I don't think I need to demonstrate that they're self-interested, that they're getting richer through public policies that benefit them, and that the whole system from its beginning is maintained to rationalize and institutionalize their domination. So when the people who elect them are getting increasingly unsatisfied with this institutionalized domination, the ultra-wealthy will have to radically criticize these institutions themselves. They can either A. criticize capitalism, the fact that it turns every aspect of our lives into commodities, criticize its wealth inequalities, its severe individualism, and the climate catastrophe it generates. They can criticize it in a way which outright advocates for dismantlement and the redistribution of power to communities. That's what the far left is advocating for. Or B. criticize the liberal elite, the Jews, illegal immigrants, feminists, BLM, Antifa, or whatever scapegoat you want, and blame them for the failures of institutionalized domination. Now, if you're ultra-wealthy, there is no choice. You fund Antifa like George Soros does. No, you actually side with fascists. In his book Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook, Mark Bray reminds us that fascism in Italy, as in Germany, did not come to power through revolution, but through legitimate, liberal, legal mechanisms. One of the reasons why historical fascists were able to use these legal mechanisms is that capitalists at the head of the state preferred Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler over the socialist threat that challenged their power and privileges. Thus, anarchist anti-fascist critiques emphasize that the capture of the liberal state by an economic elite, a phenomenon inherent to capitalism, is not only a problem in itself, but also particularly dangerous in a proto-fascist context, a context that capitalism itself tends to produce, since in such circumstances, this economic elite is incentivized to support fascists. So we've seen how capitalism creates the necessary conditions to fascism by not only creating socioeconomic anxiety, but also capturing the state and using it for capitalist interests, interests which side with fascism in periods of crisis. But beyond the parliamentary power that capitalists acquire in a capitalist representative democracy, the wealthy can exercise their power politically through various means, one of which is extremely influential. Actually, its whole purpose is to be influential. Capitalists own the media. 3. Rational debate. John Stuart Mill's liberal ideal of a marketplace of ideas that regulates itself through reasoned debate requires information that is accurate, rigorously researched, and honestly disseminated. However, whether through large media conglomerates or social media, the information relayed to the public is shared and interpreted by private companies owned by a capitalist elite, which, like the Italian and German capitalist elites of the 1920s and 30s, if forced to choose between fascism and socialism, has every incentive to drift towards the far right. Reasoned debate is difficult to access when, first, economic conditions plunge a large portion of the population into such deep alienation that they struggle to inform themselves adequately in order to participate in this rational debate, and second, the information made available to that same large portion of the population is biased in favor of a capitalist elite that benefits from misinformation. Even if reasoned debate was accessible, if we lived in a liberal utopia where economic conditions were less alienating, where everyone's participation was meaningful and relevant, and where information, being accurate, rigorously researched, and honestly disseminated, did not misinform, there would still remain, for anti-fascists, shortcomings in the liberal struggle against fascism. Reasoned debate alone is not sufficient to combat fascism for two reasons. One, many of our ideas are not shaped by reason but by material conditions specific to our social and historical context. And two, fascism is not rational. First, to illustrate the idea that our beliefs are shaped by material struggles rather than by reason, Mark Bray uses the example that the idea that racism is wrong is not the product or endpoint of a debate about racism, but rather the result of past and ongoing struggles, primarily led by people of color, through protests, demands, direct action, and other forms of pressure to establish anti-racism as a social norm. If we want to establish anti-fascism as a norm, anti-fascists argue that reason as a tactic has limits, and that social struggle rooted in material conditions is more effective in achieving that goal. Second, fascism is not rational. The irrationality of fascism is the third characteristic of fascism identified by Umberto Eco in his article Fascism, where he notes that fascism can be defined as irrationalism. Fascism is not only irrational, but historically at least, prides itself on rejecting rationality and the Enlightenment, prioritizing instead a cult of action. Anti-fascists therefore conclude that rational debate with fascists is not only futile, but may even legitimize fascist discourse. It's important to note, however, that liberal thinkers do recognize the irrationality of fascism. As Stéphanie Precioso points out in her book Découvrir l'Antifascisme, social democracy proves unable to understand the deep roots of fascism. It emphasizes its irrational nature and the aberration of its emergence in the course of the peaceful development of capitalism. There is thus a strong confidence, a liberal faith in the idea that fascism, as a historical aberration, would not reappear, and since liberal societies have experienced the disasters of irrationalism a century ago, they would not be deceived a second time. We know better now, liberals will argue. But do we really? Antifa says the stakes are way too high to trust the liberal process with weeding out bigotry, especially with its shaky track record. As Mark Bray points out, for militant anti-fascists, those historical facts have cast doubt on the liberal formula for opposing fascism. That formula essentially amounts to faith in reasoned debate to counteract fascist ideas, in the police to counteract fascist violence, and in the institutions of parliamentary government to counteract fascist attempts to seize power. There is no doubt that sometimes this formula has worked. There is also no doubt that sometimes it has not. For these reasons, anti-fascists, again according to Bray, are illiberal and adopt tactics consistent with that stance. Among these tactics are physical confrontation, which we'll talk about later, and deplatforming. This leads to the third anti-fascist critique of the liberal strategy to fight fascism, the dogma of freedom of speech. At the heart of the anti-fascist outlook is a rejection of the classical liberal phrase incorrectly ascribed to Voltaire that "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." After Auschwitz and Treblinka, anti-fascists committed themselves to fighting to the death the ability of organized Nazis to say anything. I think it's important before tackling this topic to identify an important component of censorship: authority. Censorship has often been associated with the government, a religious authority, or big corporations having power over the means of communication. Encyclopedia Britannica defines censorship as the changing or the suppression or prohibition of speech or writing that is deemed subversive of the common good. It occurs in all manifestations of authority to some degree, but in modern times it has been of special importance in its relation to government and the rule of law. When someone or a group of people suppress speech that is deemed subversive of the common good, it's technically censorship, but not as we commonly understand it. If someone yells the N-word and gets kicked out of a venue, it's technically censorship, but it's nothing like being put in prison for it. There's an important difference. Antifa has gained recent popularity, or at least notoriety, during events where activists attempted to suppress the speech of well-known far-right figures such as the influencer Milo Yiannopoulos or Richard Spencer. This censorship has been the subject of many liberal criticisms, which are themselves criticized by Antifa. We will address two of these critiques made by liberals: the moral critique and the pragmatic critique. First, the moral critique consists of 1. Defending freedom of expression as a virtue in itself, relying on the noble idea of fighting to the death to defend the right to say anything. 2. Arguing that ideas should not be suppressed simply because we disagree with them. And 3. Claiming that suppressing fascist speech is itself a form of fascism. 1. Antifa agrees that freedom of expression is a virtue, since this value aligns closely with the anarchist principles they embrace. An anti-fascist response to a liberal defender of free speech might be to criticize how freedom of expression is defended in liberal society. Although liberal societies guarantee equality before the law, they are deeply unequal in practice. A citizen cannot freely express themselves to an authority figure who can wield enormous power over them. A police officer, a landlord in the case of a tenant, or more significantly, an employer. If you voice the wrong opinion, you can get fired from your job. You can literally lose the ability to feed and house yourself if you offend your boss with the wrong form of speech. Since Antifa is opposed to both the state and capitalism, anti-fascist militants advocate for a broader conception of freedom of speech than the one proposed by liberals. However, beyond pointing out this inconsistency, anti-fascists may also invoke a utilitarian argument, echoing John Stuart Mill and his work on utilitarianism. For example, to quote Southside anti-racist action, if someone's beliefs are based off of the oppression of others, that belief poses a bigger threat to our society than the discomfort or pain experienced by those who hold them. 2. The liberal moral critique may also accuse anti-fascists of trying to remove a public figure's platform because of a simple disagreement, placing all ideas on an equal footing and refusing to recognize the inherent danger of certain ideas. For liberals, ideas in themselves are not problematic. Our disagreements are only theoretical, they're just ideas, and they're fine as long as they're not accompanied by illegal or illiberal actions. 3. This leads to the critique summed up as censoring fascists is the real fascism. Beyond the fact that this argument reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of fascism, Mark Bray shows that, for these liberal critics, opposition to fascism is not based on the danger of its ideas, but on the fact that the movement and its actions are illiberal. They conflate fascism with illiberalism. Therefore, as we've seen with the horseshoe theory, if anti-fascists are illiberal, they are, in liberal eyes, similar to fascists. I know I've quoted this already, but it's so good I want to quote it a second time. If your main objection to Nazism is its suppression of the meetings of the opposition, then that says more about your politics than about those you are critiquing. Anti-fascists don't oppose fascism because it is illiberal in the abstract, but because it promotes white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, ultranationalism, authoritarianism, and genocide. Secondly, the pragmatic liberal critique consists of arguing that suppression of speech as a tactic harms the anti-fascist movement. This critique is not exclusive to liberals. It can also be found within militant anti-fascist circles themselves. It includes 1. The idea that speech suppression may encourage committed fascists rather than discourage them. 2. The idea that speech suppression may, through a slippery slope argument, lead to an authoritarian drift. And 3. The argument that campaigning to remove a fascist platform may actually give them a much larger one from which to portray themselves as victims. 1. Although repression can indeed encourage dissent and stubbornness, the anti-fascist strategy is to increase the social cost of fascist engagement. The idea is that the higher the cost of engaging in fascism, through stigmatization, fear, or confrontation, the less attractive it becomes. We'll address this in more detail later. 2. The idea that anti-fascist censorship could, through a slippery slope, lead to an authoritarian Antifa regime is a bit ridiculous because first, anti-fascists reject the state and refuse to collaborate with it. Second, they operate on a local and small-scale basis. And third, censorship of fascists exists in certain countries, such as Germany, without those countries becoming more vulnerable to excessive censorship. 3. Although militant anti-fascists recognize that fascists thrive on victimization and may gain a significant platform when they are deplatformed, they nonetheless argue that this gain has diminishing returns. That is, over time, getting constantly deplatformed doesn't give you much more attention after the first couple of times. Although high-profile speakers enjoy the controversy around being shut down, there is clearly a diminishing marginal return on scandal. Every time Coulter and Yiannopoulos get banned or shut down, the media and public will care a little less. The columns from the free speech warriors will likely eventually slow down as they run out of new points and their ability to manufacture outrage dissipates. Making it a nightmare for campus groups and administrators to have such speakers on campus will inevitably reduce the number of invitations. Although anti-fascists value freedom of expression, even more so than liberals, they do not uphold it as an absolute, seeing limits where, instead of increasing happiness and social cohesion, it does quite the opposite. According to Antifa, rational debate within the marketplace of ideas enabled by freedom of expression and promoted by liberalism is not a sufficient tactic to protect our communities against fascism. Thus, to address these shortcomings, non-governmental censorship is one of the illiberal tactics advocated by Antifa. However, it is not always sufficient, and another illiberal tactic, the use of confrontation, sometimes physical or violent, may also be defended by Antifa. Now, that might be why you know about Antifa. As Vysotsky writes, while violence isn't the defining characteristic of Antifa activism, it is clearly the distinguishing one. Antifa Tactics. Alright, so, by this point, you should be on board with Antifa philosophy and its criticism of both fascism and liberalism. So what do we do now? What you and your Antifa friends want to do is first identify and assess a fascist threat. We will do so abstractly, but you can do it at home by identifying your local fascists, if there are any. Then you need to adopt a strategy. We will provide you with the Antifa strategy here. Finally, you need to determine the tactics you will use to put that strategy into action. We will showcase what tactics are available to you and how to choose from them. Fascism as a threat. Fascism is threatening. We all agree that if the far right gets in power, we're all in trouble. But assessing this threat will determine your response to it. As mentioned earlier, when Antifa mobilizes, it isn't against an abstract far right. It's against particular movements or clusters of movements. So assessing threats is directly related to the presence of these specific movements in communities. Many liberals and conservatives may say that these movements are marginal, that the threat they represent is minimal and can therefore either be ignored or be ruled out by rational debate. Antifa, however, disagrees. Obviously. For many people, fascist activism and violence is an abstraction. It is something that they read about or see in news reports. Those fascists gather in bars that they will never frequent, attend music events they'll never go to, protest in the streets of faraway cities. For the militant anti-fascist activists, the threat posed by fascists was much closer to home and very real. The Antifa experience is defined in part by an intimate understanding of not only the fascist ideological commitment to violence, but fascist activists' willingness to use it. This level of threat, in part, drives anti-fascist militancy as a form of self-defense. We've talked about how Antifa sees any small fascist movement as a threat because historical experiences show that, for example, Italy's regime started with 100 members, the Third Reich with 54. Also, fascists don't need a crazy coup d'etat to gain power. As we've seen, they took power in Italy and Germany through legalistic means. Finally, historically, fascism wasn't taken seriously enough until it was too late. Taking this into consideration, Antifa refuses to repeat this mistake again. They refuse to minimize any kind of threat posed by fascists. They have a zero-tolerance policy for it. A small group of 50 fascists is already too many fascists. But beyond the threat fascists represent ideologically in terms of taking power, there's also the immediate threat of tolerating fascists, because that's where the crux of the battle is, right? Do we want to tolerate fascism? Antifa are not tolerant of fascists because of the immediate physical threat they represent. Their presence in spaces are threatening to ethnic, national, linguistic, sexual, and religious minorities. Before you start tolerating the KKK in your community, you may want to take in consideration how Black people and Jews feel about you tolerating these guys and how your tolerance, or defending their free speech, may enable or empower them. Added to this, leftists themselves are also directly threatened by fascists, which gives them the most impetus to fight back against them. Because the very existence of leftists and minorities is antithetical to fascism, fighting fascism is a form of self-defense. As Vysotsky writes while talking about fascist provocations, these fascist events are deliberately organized in locations that will draw a vigorous and militant anti-fascist response. And event organizers often explicitly goad anti-fascists into confrontation by bragging about their strength and making threats against Antifa activists on social media. This is exactly what I experienced 4 years after this book was published. You may understand why I love this book so much. In any case, fascists pose a direct threat to minorities and leftists through their very existence, and will start by outwardly provoking them and escalating from there if they aren't stopped. That's why militant anti-fascists don't give them an inch. You fight them by writing letters and making phone calls so you don't have to fight them with fists. You fight them with fists so you don't have to fight them with knives. You fight them with knives so you don't have to fight them with guns. You fight them with guns so you don't have to fight them with tanks. Vysotsky therefore concludes, both the history of fascist violence and the immediate experiences of anti-fascists indicate that the threats they face are indeed credible. The militant response, therefore, is designed to neutralize the total threat, a concept taken from sociologist Thomas Mayer, that fascists pose. Strategy. So what's the Antifa strategy? What can we do in the face of such a threat? What's an appropriate strategy to fight fascism? Sociologists Meir Zald and Bert Useem identify 3 ways counter-movements, which Antifa is sort of the pinnacle of, can counter movements. See what I did there? Anyway, there's damage or destruction of the other group, preemption or dissuasion of group mobilization, and recruitment of the other group's members. Different tactics militant anti-fascists use will have one or many of those side effects, but very honestly, the overarching idea is to destroy the other group. It's to destroy fascism. There's also a preemption or dissuasion of group mobilization, but that kind of comes in with the idea of destroying fascism. When a movement engages in damage or destruction of another movement, it seeks to try to raise the cost of mobilization for the other group. This is really important. You'll see why. And the sentence, try to raise the cost of mobilization for the other group, is one which is crucial to understand Antifa tactics. These are terms used by Bray, Vysotsky, and by the Front Peuple, an anti-fascist organization we'll mention later. It basically means to make mobilization harder, to put more barriers and obstacles in the face of mobilization. That is Antifa's strategy. If it's already hard to mobilize people, Antifa's strategy is to make it even harder for fascists using a variety of tactics. These tactics include boycotts, denunciations, doxing, protests, etc. Notice how none of these are inherently violent. There's no punching or window breaking. Yet. Indeed, if Antifa has been singled out for its violence, it's because violent tactics, which most anti-fascist militants agree with, are the only tactics highlighted by the media. What has made Antifa so popular, it's those controversial tactical choices and nothing else. Tactical choices. The idea is to stop fascism by any means necessary. Necessary here doing a lot of the heavy lifting. If Antifa mobilizes to stop a Nazi rally, they may first contact the venue's owners to tell them that their brand is being associated with Nazis. If that doesn't work, you can call for a boycott demonstrating the venue's complicity with fascists. If that doesn't put an end to it, you can protest in front of the venue before or during the rally. During that rally, you can do disruption, unplug speakers, trigger the fire alarm, smoke up the place with smoke devices, or disrupt it by being loud. Disrupting? Yes. Illegal? Yeah, probably. Violent? Maybe? Not nearly as much as the right and the media are framing it as. We're not talking bombs and kidnappings here. And we're definitely not talking terrorism. So the choice of tactic is circumstantial. Anti-fascist militants will stop fascist mobilization by any means necessary, so they'll only do what's necessary if they need to. It's a lot more simple that way. There will be an escalation proportional to what the circumstances require. When these tactics are used, it's important to note that they're determined democratically within the group. For example, when my friends and I organized an Antifa festival as a response to the allegedly fascist festival, it was a tactic from many other options that we opted for. We picked the one we believed was the most apt to our circumstances, which is why decentralization is important to Antifa. But beyond choosing tactics democratically and escalationally, I guess, one of the most important factors in deciding one tactic over another is its effectiveness. A group will pick the most effective tactic to accomplish their goal, to raise the cost of mobilization for fascists. However, as Vysotsky argues, the choice of tactics is less linked to their effectiveness than to their perceived effectiveness. That's really important. My PowerPoint doesn't have the quote again, so I'll have to add it in post. That's what YouTubers say, or like people who make videos, they say, we'll add it in post. It's lingo. It's like a dog whistle, but for video makers. These perceptions are often the products of the interplay of culture and structure. Non-militant activists choose legitimate means of action because they are structurally positioned to have access to power and because their life experience indicates that such access may be successful even when it isn't. Let me illustrate this. On August 29, 2020, the statue of Sir John A. Macdonald was toppled by violent BLM rioters. People didn't understand why that was the case, but John A. Macdonald, the Prime Minister of Canada, was super racist, especially to Indigenous people, by deliberately starving them by creating residential schools, creating the RCMP, and saying things like, in 1885, the Aryan races will not wholesomely amalgamate with the Africans or the Asiatics. That was only 4 years before Hitler was born. Only 10 years after these statements, they put up a statue of him in Montreal. Anyway, if you're interested in art, Indigenous issues, John A. Macdonald, and the RCMP, I made a video on Kent Monkman's depiction of the RCMP that you may like. Anyway, the statue was toppled and some people didn't really understand why. Among these people was a member of my family who, after being explained why John A. Macdonald was really bad and didn't deserve a public statue, still raised concerns about the tactics used to take down the monument. They could have written a petition or protested peacefully, they said. To people who don't engage in politics, they believe peaceful protests and petitions work. They've never done it, but they were told that's how you do things and that peaceful ways are the ways you get things done. However, people who actually engage in popular politics know from experience that people in power don't listen unless you make them listen. There was, in the case of the toppled statue, petitions to take it down, peaceful protests, and it was even vandalized. I showed this to my family member and asked, what are activists supposed to do? What happens when the system who supposedly works for the people actually doesn't? It rarely ever does it? Who was that radical, again, who said that a riot is the language of the unheard? I feel like that quote applies here. Anyway, doing activist work quickly makes you realize that legal methods, when fighting power, aren't enough, because legal methods are tools given to you by those in power. If the person you're fighting gives you tools to fight them, those tools are probably ineffective. This explains why people who are comfortable, people who believe in these tools, liberals who believe the system works because they're somewhat benefiting from it, people who have access to its mechanisms of power or who believe they do, will opt for more liberal tactics such as petitions and voting. When you don't believe in these system-friendly tactics because, through experience, you felt casted out by that system, you may opt for more unconventional means. Nonviolent tactics. Anti-fascists conduct research on the far right online, in person, and sometimes through infiltration. They dox them, push cultural milieus to disown them, pressure bosses to fire them, and demand that venues cancel their shows, conferences, and meetings. They organize educational events, reading groups, trainings, athletic tournaments, and fundraisers. They write articles, leaflets, and newspapers, drop banners, and make videos. See? They make videos. Mark Bray does know what he's talking about. Intelligence. It's no coincidence that we talk about intelligence right after mentioning videos. The peak of Antifa activism. Antifa does research, gathering as much evidence as possible in particular fascists and fascist groups in order to identify their ideas and assess the level of threat. This research can be done online, looking through social media history, through specific forums such as the Black Vault Hate Preserved forum, and some Antifa activists have even infiltrated specific far-right groups to monitor their activity. We go where they go. End quote. This is a famous Antifa principle. For example, where there are fascist football hooligans, you may find anti-fascist football hooligans. Where there are Nazi punks, you'll have Antifa punks. There will be anti-fascist punk bands, concerts which may be used to sell merch and raise funds for anti-fascist actions. Same applies to NSBM or National Socialist Black Metal, skinheads, or other areas which either have a high fascist presence or are more vulnerable to fascist talking points such as hyper-masculine milieus. An example of hyper-masculine milieus are gun clubs, among which include the popular John Brown Gun Club, an anti-capitalist, anti-fascist gun club whose aim is to promote gun safety and to place guns in a context of community self-defense, which makes sense considering leftists being untrustworthy of the police and of other paramilitary organizations such as ICE. It also makes sense considering right-wingers own most guns. Not all leftists are liberals. Actually, both are very different. Another such milieu is mixed martial arts. In Montreal, for example, you have the Black Flag Combat Club, a pay-what-you-can anti-fascist martial arts and self-defense club. Such Antifa alternatives can fight the monopoly that the far-right may have on certain subcultures, can make these subcultures more accessible, and may even help de-radicalize some people. Imagine you're a football fan and you like the community and sense of belonging that hooligans provide, but you don't really fuck with their racism. Instead of staying with those racist hooligans and risk being desensitized to their hate or even participate in it, you can join Antifa hooligans. There's a song called Antifa Hooligans.
Antifa hooligans! Come on!
Propaganda. Educational events, reading groups, articles, leaflets, and newspapers, banner drops, videos. A large part of what anti-fascist militants do is to educate themselves or the broader population on fascist ideology, presence, and danger. You might find zines, events, or videos online. Videos are obviously the most effective and important way to do Antifa propaganda, especially when these videos are liked, shared, and commented on by a bunch of militant Antifa activists. That's when anti-fascist action peaks. The idea here is not only to have a better educated and politically informed population, but also make sure that our communities understand the danger that fascism poses and remain vigilant and intolerant of its attempts at emergence. I believe, and I think many Antifa activists would agree, that a politically illiterate population is one which will tolerate fascism. How does it go again? The Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, "I agree with you in the goals you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action." However, there's another aspect of propaganda that goes beyond the means of simply educating, and this aspect is that of marking space. When fascists put up stickers, posters, and graffiti, they indicate to their opponents that they are claiming that space as territory, that they are, at minimum, active in, and potentially control. This material also sends a message of intimidation to people of color, religious minorities, LGBTQ people, queer people, and leftist activists that fascists are active in that community, which constitutes a form of intimidation and threat. Reversely, Antifa stickers signal that Antifa activists are in this neighborhood, and hopefully, it might dissuade fascists from thinking of doing a hate crime or harass minorities. The same way fascist stickers may intimidate minorities, Antifa stickers may intimidate fascists. If you're not an idiot or a fascist, though they're not mutually exclusive, one of those is good. The other is bad. When I walk in my neighborhood and see leftist posters for a 1st of May demonstration being ripped, I know there's someone problematic in my neighborhood, not only for their opinions, those people are everywhere, but more importantly, they're problematic enough to take these posters off. I know my neighborhood is a little less safe when I see that. However, when I see Antifa stickers, Antifa graffiti, when I see a nationalist graffiti being reclaimed or covered, I feel more comfortable. I imagine a lot of people do too. Finally, they dox them, push cultural milieus to disown them, pressure bosses to fire them, and demand that venues cancel their shows, conferences, and meetings. If propaganda assures that a community continues to perceive the far right as hateful and dangerous, it's so that we can use the social stigma associated with being a fascist against fascists as a way to raise the cost of mobilization for their movement. When a fascist is being doxed, as we've explained earlier, it's done to raise the social cost of mobilization. You lose social capital. Your family and neighbors might see you differently, may be disappointed and ashamed of you. It might be terrible to be called out as a fascist, and it might be so terrible that you might want to sue people for it. Safety break. Hello, here's your Antifa safety advisor here. There's a reason why Antifa activists conceal their identity. Yes, some actions they do are illegal and they want to hide from the police, but it's also to hide from fascists. Fascists, even though they love to boast about how much they love free speech, they actually really don't. They love free speech insofar as it gives them the right to say hateful things in public. If you are identified as Antifa by fascists or by the police, you may be the target of surveillance, intimidation, or violence. For example, Vysotsky tells the story of a videographer who got identified for posting a video of an Antifa protest, and because the Antifa militants weren't identifiable, fascists decided to target this videographer. He had his address publicly posted with the label anti-white. Even if you haven't done anything wrong or illegal, even if you were simply associated with Antifa, even if you simply called out a fascist with publicly accessible information online, they will try to silence you, either by threatening you or by threatening to sue you. If I may remind you, threatening to sue for defamation is to threaten to use the state, its police, and its court system to silence you. If someone is telling you to shut the fuck up, or they'll have you pay for lawyers and drag you down a legal battle for a couple of years, that someone is attacking your free speech. They're intimidating you to silence you. If you conceal your identity, they can't do that. This is the reason why many Antifa activists hide their faces. So consider these arguments if you ever associate with them, or if you ever hear someone admonish anti-fascists for wearing masks. So there's a social cost to being outed as a fascist, and being doxxed and pushed out of a cultural milieu for your ideas capitalizes on that social cost. But there can also be a financial cost to being a fascist. Getting fired from your job because employers don't want to be associated with someone who's far right is a financial cost to mobilization. If your business associates with the far right and people call to boycott said business, or if there's vandalism, this represents a financial cost to mobilization. If you organize a far-right concert in a venue and the venue cancels because they learn that you're far-right and they rightfully don't want to be associated with you, you'll have to either find another venue, which might cost more, or reimburse everyone who bought tickets. There's also just an energy cost to any mobilizing, and this cost increases when obstacles keep being introduced. Oh, and sometimes these obstacles are violent. Let's see how. Violent Tactics, or Fucking Liberals Part 3. This, by the way, is another point of tension between liberalism and Antifa, the use of violence and when said violence is legitimate to use. Although it is not exclusive to liberal regimes, the Weberian idea that the state holds a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence is central to liberalism. For liberals, the state's monopoly on legitimate violence is meant to ensure peace and social cohesion, and Above all, to encourage citizens to resolve their disputes through speech and debate, either among themselves or in court. In all cases, citizens are not supposed to resort to violence. Which brings us to this radical quote. The Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action. This admonishment of violence from white moderates or liberals applies both to interpersonal relations between citizens and to political life. The use of violence by social movements, whether marginalized, working class, or political, is strictly condemned and rejected by liberalism. The liberal ideal is that customs, values, and social norms should be determined through discourse, speech, and debate. However, as we have seen, anti-fascists believe that these social norms are shaped by conflict, not only of ideas, but also material conflict, real-world action. This is why when liberals call for peaceful protest, petitions, or participation in elections to bring about social change, anti-fascists argue that this is not sufficient. Conflict, confrontation, and sometimes even violence, history shows, have driven struggles forward. Liberals prefer to confine this conflict to the realm of ideas. This does not mean, however, that liberals are pacifists. The idea that the state holds a monopoly on legitimate violence does not necessarily mean that this violence is rarely used. On the contrary, it only means that the wielders of violence are those in power, which means, in our case, the ultra-wealthy. As Anatole France wrote in 1894, the law, in its majestic equality, forbids both the rich and the poor from sleeping under bridges, begging in the streets, and stealing bread. In other words, the poor are sent to prison, and the rich get away with whatever the fuck they want. Liberal, peaceful solutions still involve violence. When disputes between citizens are resolved through the police, whose mere authority and armed presence introduce violence into a situation, or through the courts, which can impose monetary or physical penalties, an element of violence is still present in conflict resolution. Resolution, not revolution, by the way. In Germany, you can go to prison for up to 5 years for denying the Holocaust. That's a lot more violent than getting punched. Yet one is considered violent and the other isn't. If Antifa captured a Holocaust denier for 5 years, conservatives would go fucking crazy. Yet, when Germany does it, nobody bats an eye. Their opposition to violence and to free speech repression is not about the principle, it's about who has the power to do it. Militant anti-fascists, especially in their anarchist variant, are highly critical of the state, its police, and the role they play in preserving the status quo. They're also critical of the liberal insistence on combating fascism on the level of ideas. Thus, as mentioned earlier, anti-fascists not only refuse to turn to the state to fight fascism, but see it as a collaborating enemy, an institution that both defends the right of fascists to exist and upholds capitalism, both of which are viewed as preconditions for the rise of fascism. As a result, anti-fascists' nonviolent tactics may still be framed as violence since, as a group, they are perceived as opponents to liberalism. For example, anti-fascists might pressure a hotel hosting fascists by contacting its owners, organizing media campaigns, or calling for boycotts, or they might pressure a cinema that allows a fascist group to screen a hateful film. Although these tactics are illiberal in their essence, since it seeks to silence ideas in their dissemination rather than defeat them through reason, they're not illegal and does not directly contradict liberalism. However, they may still be framed as violent or totalitarian. Recently, the far-right libertarian leader of Quebec's Conservative Party, Éric Duhem, gave a talk in a bookstore, and some people mobilized to boycott this bookstore. May I remind you that this is both legal and actually a very capitalistic way of having your opinion heard. If anything, there's nothing more libertarian than calling for a boycott. Anyway, the Conservative Party, in all its fragility, called this an assault on free speech by leftists, saying, "We shouldn't go to a bookstore that invites far-right activists is a totalitarian attack on free speech." This position in itself is totalitarian. Resistance to an idea, whether through boycott or through protest, is kind of the hallmark of democracy and freedom. These people don't care about freedom, they just want you to shut the fuck up. However, these types of tactics, though framed as violent by the far right, are confrontational but not violent. This brings us to the tactic of violent confrontation, which some anti-fascists employ. There's not that much to say about it because first, violent tactics only represent a fraction of anti-fascist activity, and second, they're not often used. You might see property damage such as vandalism through graffiti or windows being broken. Antifa, because they're anti-capitalists, don't give divine attributes to objects and property and won't shed a tear to a window being broken, especially when people's lives and safety are on the line. Antifa militants may fight or throw projectiles when fascists take the street, as we saw at the Unite the Right rally. Harvard philosophy professor Cornel West was present.
The next day, for example, the 20 of us who were standing, many of them clergy, we would have been crushed like cockroaches if it were not for the anarchists and the anti-fascists who approached over 350 anti-fascists. We just had 20, and we singing "This Little Light of Mine." You know what I mean? So that
Antifa meaning anti-fascist.
Anti-fascists, and the crucial role of the anarchists, because they saved our lives, actually. We would have been completely crushed, and I'll never forget that.
Beyond the vandalism and the fights at protests and counter-protests, some Antifa activists punch Nazis. This tactic gained notoriety, particularly when the neo-Nazi Richard Spencer was punched in the head during a recorded interview.
Origin of the neo-Nazi movement? It's Pepe's become kind of a symbol.
The idea of confronting fascists violently, for example by punching them, resonates with many anti-fascists for several reasons. 1. Fascists cannot be reasoned with. 2. Physical confrontation can have a deterring effect. And 3. Physical confrontation can produce images that disrupt fascist narratives. 1, as mentioned earlier, fascism is not rational and may even benefit from the legitimacy gained by interacting with rational actors in public spaces. Moreover, fascists ignore and even scoff at attempts at de-escalation and non-confrontational forms of resistance. That being said, irrational fascists could, in theory, simply be ignored. This may even be a liberal strategy. However, given the danger fascists represent, anti-fascists consider that strategy of ignoring them to be irresponsible or even dangerous. Thus, if both dialogue and silence aren't going to work, the available means of combating fascism narrow, and physical confrontation enters the picture. 2. As noted earlier, anti-fascist strategy seeks to increase the cost of fascist mobilization. Pressuring a cinema to cancel a fascist screening is one such obstacle. Likewise, the widespread belief that punching a Nazi is legitimate, if socially accepted, becomes another deterrent. 3. Although fascists often portray themselves as victims, they also construct a mythic narrative in which they appear heroic, brave, masculine, and dominant. When violence is turned against them, however, this posture of dominance and bravery, on which they derive significant political capital, can collapse. One example is Richard Spencer, who, after being struck on camera, is seen fleeing to safety. Similarly, far-right activist Jake Lang was chased away during a pro-ICE protest in Minnesota a week after the killing of Renee Good by Jonathan Ross. Spencer and Lang were publicly humiliated, and images of their defeats were viewed millions of times online. These supposed heroes of the silent majority saw their narrative collapse both in person and online when their image of dominant masculinity was undermined and ridiculed. There's also the idea that, violence or not, fascists will victimize themselves. Éric Duhem, the Conservative Party leader, called a boycott campaign a totalitarian attempt at taking away his free speech. When Front Pop in Montreal organized a protest in front of a building to prevent a white supremacist podcaster from recording a show, the podcaster called it violent for blocking the entrance of the building. Yet, nobody touched him. He didn't even get out of his car. If this is violence, which I believe it is in a way, then we can't ignore the violence of white supremacist speech. And again, not all violence is morally equivalent. Do violent tactics work? We may think they don't because sometimes fascists want Antifa to attack them. It was made clear when they sent messages to provoke me. And this is a relatively new phenomenon. While clashes between fascists and anti-fascists at rallies are not new, the strategy of fascists organizing rallies specifically to provoke an anti-fascist response and potentially violent clashes is an innovation. From the fascist perspective, these clashes serve to demonstrate their willingness to engage in violence in support of their ideals and build sympathy across the political right and even in mainstream media by framing anti-fascists as aggressors. If fascists want Antifa to give them attention, perhaps we should stop giving them attention. However, as we saw earlier, the attention fascists get have diminishing returns and, as Mark Bray notes, Antifa tactics work. In the course of my interviews and research, I found a litany of cases where combinations of physical confrontations, doxing, infiltration, and other anti-fascist tactics have succeeded in shutting down or severely hampering local and national fascist organizing. And an example of such tactics working can perhaps be seen through the Richard Spencer case. Richard Spencer, a known neo-Nazi who's believed to have coined the term alt-right, who was president of the National Policy Institute, an alt-right think tank, first attracted attention for a speech he gave in Washington, D.C. in 2016.
Hail Trump! Hail our people! Hail victory!
A year later, in 2017, he launched altright.com on Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. Oh, MLK, that's who's behind these super radical quotes. Don't tell the libs. 5 days after the launch of altright.com, Richard Spencer was punched in the face. 4 months later, he was one of the leaders of the Unite the Right rally. Milo Yiannopoulos, who had also been cancelled by Antifa, notably at university speaking events, and who had lost all notoriety since, would later leak a recording of Spencer using racial slurs during the rally. As if anyone was going to be surprised by that.
I am so mad. I am so fucking mad at these people. They don't do this to fucking me. We're gonna fucking ritualistically humiliate them. I am coming back here every fucking weekend if I have to. Like, this is never over. I win, they fucking lose. That's how the world fucking works. Little fucking kikes. They get ruled by people like me. Little fucking octoroons. My ancestors fucking enslaved those pieces of fucking shit. We're gonna win. I rule the fucking world. Those pieces of shit get ruled by people like me. They look up and see a face like mine looking down at them. That's how the fucking world works. We are gonna destroy this fucking town.
After the rally's terrible outcome, Spencer was later banned from Facebook and Instagram in 2018 and from YouTube in 2020. Many university speaking events were cancelled following public or student pressure. The Southern Poverty Law Center explains the conclusion to Spencer's political career best. Wherever Spencer went, his name stirred protests, cancellations, and clashes between anti-racist demonstrators and white supremacists. Colton Fears and Tyler Tenbrink, two of Spencer's supporters, are serving prison terms after separate juries convicted them for their roles in a shooting that targeted protesters of his October 2017 event at the University of Florida in Gainesville. Spencer's efforts to stage events and the alt-right movement around him crumbled in March 2018 when police arrested over 24 people, including Gregory Conte, the director of operations for Spencer's group National Policy Institute, NPI, following violent skirmishes outside his speech at Michigan State University. Images of Spencer's supporters trading blows with protesters went viral. Answering a request for comment, Spencer confirmed to Hate Watch what researchers already sensed about him. He said that he pulled back from the movement in 2018 after the Michigan State event. He said that he experienced no single aha moment in choosing to do so. I just abandoned it, Spencer said of NPI. Spencer was quoted saying, "I feel like sometimes I can't escape my own shadow in the sense of when people still think of the alt-right, I think they almost imagine that I'm still doing what I used to be doing. I have to take responsibility on some level, I mean, I get it, but I hope that there's something to me beyond those things." Antifa as a form of prefigurative community self-defense. Antifa hates the police, and the police hate Antifa. The police, as the armed wing of the state and defenders of the privileges of the wealthy, are, at best, neutral in the fascism-anti-fascism divide, often perceived as a conflict between gangs, or at worst, they align with fascists. As for the police counteracting fascist violence, At times, the police have arrested and persecuted fascists, yet the historical record shows that, along with the military, they have also been among the most eager for a return to order. Studies show that high percentages of police voted for Golden Dawn and the Front National over the past few years. In the United States, it is clear that many police welcomed Trump as a Blue Lives Matter president who would allow law enforcement to continue its harassment and murder of communities of color unimpeded. Recently, it was revealed that the FBI had been investigating alarmingly, although not surprisingly, high levels of white supremacist infiltration into law enforcement for decades. Moreover, regardless of the composition of the US police force, the fact that it developed out of Southern slave patrols and Northern opposition to the labor movement gives us insight into its role in the white supremacist criminal justice system. I made a whole video, which I'm really proud about, but which got age restricted, please check out my Patreon, talking about a series of paintings made about the Greensboro Massacre, where the American Nazi Party and the Klan collaborated with local police to attack an anti-Klan protest. 5 demonstrators were killed, and when the police arrived on the scene, they started arresting anti-Klan protesters, who, must I remind you, had just been shot by Nazis and the KKK. In 2020, the city of Greensboro recognized the police's complicity and apologized for the events. In any case, this explains why an Antifa principle is to never go to the police to fight fascists because, firstly, they see the police as a force that has more similarities than differences with fascists, and secondly, if you want to build a world without a police, you need to be prefigurative about it. You need to create it now. Antifa, as a form of community self-defense, is prefigurative insofar as it replaces the police as a hierarchical institutions ruled by the wealthy. This is what Vysotsky argues. Anti-fascists engage in many of the activities of a formal police force: investigation, surveillance, assertion of force to contain violence or potential violence, without the monopoly power or authority rendered to police in contemporary society. Anti-fascist actions are often spontaneous, always directly democratic, and ultimately responsible to a community within which they are situated. Because of these characteristics, Antifa serves as a threat to the claims of monopoly on the use of force by the state, and therefore, the legitimacy of not only the state, but the political system as a whole. This is how Stanislav Vysotsky concludes his book, American Antifa, The Tactics, Culture, and Practice of Militant Anti-Fascism, with the provocatively titled chapter, I didn't write it once again, The Anarchy Police Revisited, a critical criminology of Antifa. In his work, Vysotsky presents Antifa as an organization, formal or informal, of collective self-defense against the fascist threat. In the chapter The Anarchy Police, he adds that this role as a community defender resembles that of the police, whether through investigation, as seen when anti-fascists infiltrate far-right networks, gather information about where fascist events are being held, or collect intelligence on potential fascists, or through protective services, maintaining a presence at events vulnerable to fascist attacks, protecting threatened comrades, or intervening in hateful demonstrations or events. Cornel West was saved by Antifa, not by the cops. Vysotsky is very clear. He understands Antifa as an anarchist organization or method of organizing, both because many anti-fascists are anarchists and because militant anti-fascism in the United States is primarily driven by an anarchist or anti-authoritarian ideology that seeks a broader economic, political, and social transformation. Anti-fascism is guided by anarchist principles. He notes that anarchists offer a strong critique of the criminal justice system, but that, with the exception of restorative justice, which addresses problems after they occur, they have not fully theorized how to deal with such situations in the immediacy of their occurrence. According to Vysotsky, the procedures anti-fascists use to handle these situations are anarchistic in nature, and because they operate in parallel to the criminal justice system, they are prefigurative. 3 key elements define the anarchism underlying Antifa self-defense intervention. It must be spontaneous, democratic, and temporary. Because these interventions are often violent, they require a certain degree of power, and these 3 characteristics ensure that this power is limited to the intervention itself. Since the interventions are spontaneous and temporary, those who intervene are simply those present, and they take up that role only for the duration of the intervention. The power they exercise over others doesn't exist outside of that intervention. The democratic aspect is also fundamental to anti-fascist organizing, both in spontaneous interventions and in more organized ones, such as protecting an individual or a location. Interventions are carried out collectively on a voluntary basis according to need, and each person's role is limited to the needs and time frame of the intervention. In general, power is decentralized because it is temporary and not invested in a durable institution. As a form of anarchist practice, militant anti-fascist confrontation is spontaneous and decentralized, thereby ensuring that authority and power are not entrenched. To give a less politicized example, many bars in rural areas are located far from police stations and do not have doormen. When a fight breaks out, the responsibility to intervene doesn't fall on an authority, but falls on staff and patrons. On patrons. The intervention is spontaneous. People shift from being customers to acting as an anarchist police when the fight begins. It's democratic. Interveners discuss among themselves what to do, and temporary. Once the situation is resolved, they return to their drinks. This mode of operation can be applied from a casual brawl to the presence of a fascist in a bar, and can scale up when applied to the presence of one or more fascists in a neighborhood. Thus, anti-fascism as a form of collective self-defense is not merely a critique of fascism, but also a critique of the criminal justice system, which concentrates power in the police, maintains that power beyond the moment it is needed, lacks democratic structure, and is not spontaneous, in the sense that not anyone can participate and that the police often arrive after the situation has already ended. Antifa offers an alternative to the police and the criminal justice system for protecting communities from fascist threats, an alternative that could serve as a model in a world without the state, police, or capitalism. However, when this alternative is practiced within the boundaries of a state that claims a monopoly on violence, it becomes prefigurative and is perceived as a threat because it undermines the fundamental principles that justify the state. It is precisely this radical challenge to the state's monopoly to the use of force that drives the hostility towards an attempted criminalization of militant anti-fascism. Attempts to label Antifa activism as a form of gang or terrorist activity are designed to delegitimize not only the actions of militant anti-fascists, but also the prefigurative practices of self-defense that they engage in. Ironically, by engaging in criminalization of anti-fascism, politicians and scholars reinforce the victimization frame deployed by fascist movements to garner sympathy and legitimize their activity and ideology. If Antifa activism is a radical form of self-defense, then it is in a three-way fight against the fascist movement and the state. Through Vysotsky's analysis, we can better understand why Antifa has been labeled a terrorist organization, despite first, not being an organization, and second, despite its most violent actions being smashing windows and fighting fascists. Again, there are no kidnappings, no terrorist bombings, no indiscriminate violence. So why was Antifa labeled a terrorist organization? Antifa is not a real threat to society, it never was, but it is a threat to the state and its hierarchical institutions that benefit the wealthy. At least a threat significantly high enough for it to call Antifa the #1 terrorist organization in the US. Fascists know that, liberals know that, the wealthy know it, and so does the media. Now, if you've gotten this far into the video and you're still on the fence about Antifa, or you still, as MLK denounced, agree with us in the goal we seek, but you cannot agree with our methods of direct action, I urge you to consider what and who benefits from your denunciation, who benefits from the status quo, from the lack of confrontation, who benefits from doing things the right way, the way the state wants us to do things. Unless you're filthy rich or a fascist, you're not the one benefiting. Thank you so much for watching. I'm losing my voice. That was really bad. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for liking and subscribing if you haven't already. I'd like to thank all my patrons who support the channel, who allow me to take, a month break to publish this video. Without you, this wouldn't be possible because YouTube ads don't like it when I take a month to make a video. Thank you so much. If you've got this far and you believe that the whole video was worth at least $1? $10? You can subscribe to Patreon and subscribe to the Patreon for $1 per month minimum. And then you get to be part of the credits, the people who are here, I think. Yeah, here. If you want to be part of these people, among which are Rowan Brandel, X-Towns, Chrissy Chris, and Bone Meal, they allow me to make videos on Antifa on an art history channel. Thank you so much. I don't know if I've said this already. I'm super tired. I've been recording all day. This is a long video. I believe it's going to be longer than the anti-fascist, or longer than the fascist video. So it's a lot of work. It's going to be a lot of work to edit. I'm leaving tomorrow for New Brunswick. So I got to pack up. I've got a lot of things to do. But thank you so much for watching. It's so appreciated. And thank you for getting this far, because it's a long video. So thank you for your commitment. Thank you so much. Thank you, 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 thank you. And that's it. All right. See you in the next video. Goodbye.